Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was an exquisitely beautiful, idyllic, welcoming and sunny day in early spring. The long drawn-out, bitterly cold Arctic winter was finally behind us, and my husband Roy and I lay on the picnic rug, soaking up the sunshine like hungry lizards coming out of a convoluted, prolonged hibernation. The flowery meadow was vibrant with colourful, showy spring flowers, from purples to pinks, lilacs, blues and yellows, some with petals shaped like dangling bells, and others were tightly clustered together like roses. The prairie was set against the statuesque mountain views of Washington State, along with clusters of Douglas firs, their pine needles enveloping the air in a fresh woody scent. Neither of us said a single word. The silence was sweet, golden, and somewhat pleasantly intoxicating. And somehow, saying anything at all spoilt the magic of this illustrious moment. We both watched the two horses in the opposite field, basking in the radiance of the sunshine, and shaking their long dark manes. And we were both bedazzled and beguiled by the beauty of this tranquil day, that is still crisply marked in the memory, as if it were yesterday for me. I raised myself off the ground, reluctantly wiping the grass off my jeans, and glancing briefly at my watch. We better be getting back, I sighed. Great Aunt May will be expecting us back for tea. We held hands together, filled with the joy of our fresh new love, which was in the spring of its awakening. We walked through the undulating emerald green grass towards the charming farmhouse. This imposing house really rather reminded me of an old, quaint English cottage, only it was much larger and grander in size and scale, with whitewashed brick walls, ample-sized bay windows, and sizable Wedgwood blue shutters that overlooked ravishing, awe-inspiring views of the countryside, accentuated by a stylish pale blue front door, surrounded by pretty climbing yellow roses. We walked through the stylish open courtyard that was framed by an arched trellis of climbing red roses, and on either side of the elegant arch was a terraced, very manicured front yard, with chessboard-like squares that alternated between squares of grass and of terracotta, all perfectly fringed by miniature hedges and beds of lavender and red roses. Before long we were in the living-room area, having what our eccentric aunt always referred to as high tea, born from her distinguished English lineage on her mother's side of the family. Aunt May was famous for her teas in the local town, and always served delicate cucumber or salmon sandwiches made from the thinnest delicate triangles of bread, boiled eggs with squares of toasts, scones with jam and clotted cream, chocolate cake, and apple and custard Danish pastries. Aunt May was a very elegant, stylish elderly lady in her early 80s, who wore tweed skirts, cashmere sweaters and pearls, and her white hair was always swept back in a tight, neat bun. I watched her shaking as she poured us piping hot cups of English breakfast tea into royal Doulton china cups, and she always joked that she made builder's tea, because in England the builders always drank their tea extra strong, which was just how Aunt May liked it. She absolutely loathed modern mugs, as she claimed tea drunk from a delicate porcelain china cup was infinitely more pleasurable, and over time, when I began to drink tea this way, I believed she was absolutely right. "You are probably wondering why I invited you both over to stay the weekend here with me," she said, looking at us through her piercing Arctic blue eyes. "No, not really, Aunt May," I said. "It's always lovely to see you, especially staying with you in the country like this. It's so beautiful out here. It's so much nicer than being stuck in Seattle." "Well, I'm glad to hear it," said Aunt May. "I have a proposition for the both of you," she said. "You can see I'm not getting any younger these days, and managing this farm of mine has become increasingly difficult and more like a burden than a pleasure. Unfortunately, my advancing years is beginning to take its toll on my body, which is not what it used to be. Sadly, the progression of age is not for the faint-hearted, I can assure you. I know the two of you lovebirds recently got married, and I wondered if you fancied laying the foundation of your nest here by managing this farm for me, and I'll pay you for your trouble, of course. I do have one condition, and that is I want to live here with the both of you, in the downstairs bedroom, until I finally pop my clogs. After that, this whole place will be yours. I couldn't bear the idea of spending my last days in a nursing home. I won't ask you to care for a frail old lady, because if I need a nurse, I'll almost certainly get one, as I have no intention of becoming a burden to anyone, least of all you. But I don't want to leave this place, as it's always been my home, and this is where I would like to breathe my very last. What do you say?" My husband and I looked at each other in complete astonishment. "You're leaving this place to us?" I asked, "in your will?" "Yes, that is my intention," said Aunt May. "I want to leave my home to someone who will truly appreciate it and value it as much as I have done over the years. Evangeline, I've had you in my mind for inheriting my home since you were 16 years old." "Why me?" I asked. "Well, you are very different to your two younger sisters. You've always been so comfortable out here on the farm. And growing up as a young girl, you loved it. I think this lifestyle would fit you perfectly like a glove, and this house needs an owner that truly appreciates her. I've always believed that houses choose their owners." And so it was my husband and I moved in with Aunt May. It was a no-brainer for us, as we'd always fancied living in the countryside, and I didn't know a more magnificent country abode than Aunt May's beautiful home, so inheriting her exquisite farmhouse was more than I could have ever envisaged or forecast for my life. It was like all my Christmases had come at once. My husband's job working as a writer for a corporate company meant he could work from home, and so things could not have been more perfect as far as we were both concerned, and living with my great-aunt May during the last decade of her life I saw as a complete privilege rather than an inconvenience. If she had been a tumultuous, disagreeable, cantankerous sort of character, that would have been a completely different matter, of course, but Aunt May was as sweet as you could get. "I have something very significant to show you," said Aunt May, "and now that you've moved in, you need to know about it." She led us down to her cellar and pulled away a table and chairs, removing the rug off the floor, and we discerned a well-hidden trap-door that appeared to be locked. I was utterly astonished. "What's this?" I asked my aunt, looking at her with a perplexed expression on my face. "It's not where you've stashed away all your nuggets of gold bullion, is it?" I teased. Aunt May's blue eyes twinkled with humour. "I wish," she giggled. "I wouldn't be adverse to having a treasure trove down here, but alas, that's not what this is." "More's the shame," I joked. "What is this then, Aunt May?" I asked. "Your great-uncle's father built this in 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, after which the United States declared war on Japan. That was when Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. I gather it was referred to as Hitler's most puzzling decision of World War II. As you know, we were officially considered neutral during the war at the time. Your great-uncle's father hated, despised, and loathed Hitler with a fervent passion. He did not trust that evil, duplicitous man as far as you could throw him. He would say, "Look at that obnoxious, deplorable man. He's trying to mind control the masses. Like innocent lambs, he is leading them to the slaughter. Why are the people so bedazzled by his words, as though they're under some kind of hypnotic hold? It breaks my heart to see this going on in our lifetime. Who knows if our children's children will have any hope for their futures?" He was, of course, not wrong about that. So convinced he was that the Germans might ultimately invade America that he decided to build this underground tunnel that leads directly from the house to the woods. He wanted the family to have means of escape if German soldiers came knocking at our door, and of course a safe place to hide if indeed we were being bombed, which of course was highly unlikely to happen given how sprawling and widespread America actually is, as bombers would be more likely to attack a very built-up area like New York, much like the air raids and bombings on London. "How big is it?" I asked. "The tunnel, I mean." "It's big enough, but I have not been in there for years," said Aunt May. "Why not?" I asked my aunt. "You could have turned it into an extra storage area or something." "It's haunted," said my aunt, looking at me with wide, earnest eyes, "which is why you must keep it locked at all times and leave well alone." "How do you know it's haunted?" I asked. "Your great-uncle decided to explore the tunnel one day, long after the house became into our possession, after his father had died. I remember it had been snowing heavily that day, with very severe blizzards and freezing conditions, so we stayed inside by a crackling fire and played cards and all kinds of board games to keep ourselves busy. My husband was a very hyped-up individual, so keeping him contained was pretty much like keeping a Jack Russell in a shoebox for days on end. It was like he had ants in his pants. He was so frustrated about being snowed in by the brutally unkind weather conditions. That was when he thought about exploring the tunnel underground and ventured in there with his torch and, of course, layers of warm clothing, and off he went. I never wanted to accompany him. It looked awfully sinister inside. I remember when he came back, he was as white as a sheet, and all the colour had drained from his face, and he was shaking like a leaf. I asked him what on earth was wrong, but he stared at me very blankly, and was so withdrawn and subdued that he didn't say a word for 2 whole days. It really was very disturbing. "What? He never spoke to you for 2 whole days?" I asked. "That's extraordinary. He must have been really spooked by something." "That's exactly what I concluded. I knew something quite dreadful must have happened to him. But what? I couldn't fathom. Finally, when he did actually speak, he told me that this underground passage was a portal to the underbelly of hell itself." "What?" "Sorry, I don't mean to be rude, Aunt May. I'm only laughing, for the very notion of what you suggest is utterly ridiculous." "Well, I believe, Ted," said Aunt May. "Laugh as much as you like, Evangeline, but your great-uncle did not scare easily. So if you had seen him that day, you wouldn't have doubted his word either. I knew he'd seen something quite terrible underground. Quite terrible," she repeated. "Well, what exactly did he claim to have seen, Aunt May?" I asked. "Your uncle describes walking down a very long, dark, gloomy, cheerless tunnel, and being violently hit or assaulted by a nasal explosion of sulphurous compounds that smelt of rotting, decaying flesh, that made his eyes burn and his body become nauseous and sick, as so repugnant, vile, and sickly sweet and odorous was that stench. Without question, the smell was of death itself. It was when he turned left down the dusty passage, strewn with silken cobwebs and colossal-looking spiders, that he saw several large rats bolting past him warily in the darkness. At this point, his heart rate had increased in intensity, and he could feel its thunderous vibration pounding through his chest, and he described feeling exceedingly claustrophobic. He knew in his heart he shouldn't be there, but he needed to see what lay beyond the passage, And that was when your uncle ascertained that he had entered into an ambiguous realm or underworld, if you like, that was like a tributary to hell itself, that belonged to the souls of the damned. It was in a moment of horrified revulsion, through the intense, bleak darkness, he beheld the tall, dark, shadowy silhouettes of giant demonical creatures stoking up the flames of a crackling, thriving fire, using timber sticks to increase its intensity of heat, which he described as unbearable, stuffy, and overwhelming. Worse still, he saw animal skeletons lying scattered all over the ground. Everything was blacker than the inkiest black, and the darkness was smoky, smouldery, and thick. All of a sudden, he could perceive these demonical, hulky, shadowy forms, again in greater visual authenticity, and described them seemingly darker than the darkness itself, with burly, fuzzy shapes and bright, dazzling red eyes that were so menacing that he said his blood turned as cold as ice. He described with great trepidation and angst a towering 10-foot giant turning around to look directly at him, and upon seeing him the entity curled back its lips and unleashed the most blood-curdling scream, and your great-uncle ran down the tunnel as fast as he possibly could, with his adrenaline surging through his blood at an alarming pace, while the demonical being was in hot pursuit of him, and was clearly desirous to seize him and drag him into the inferno reserved for the wicked. He could hear its dragon-like, deep, guttural breaths. Your great-uncle was completely terrified, and when he reached the door in the cellar, he promptly locked it behind him, and he could hear the beast tapping at the door. And this happened for many long days. Your great-uncle would walk in those woods sometimes at night, and there were occasions he would swear blindly that even those woods became connected sometimes to the perilous, unspeakable portal in the abyss in some way, for he had seen shadowy, dark figures moving between the trees and watching him. He had felt their eyes on him, and heard their disembodied screams that sounded like a woman being murdered. He even told me once that he had seen smoke rising from the ground in the woods, and dissipating in a strange spiral that was not of this world. Your description sounds awful, Aunt May, I said, but I find it exceedingly difficult to believe that there actually is a portal to hell in this home. I just don't see it somehow. That sort of thing doesn't happen. I mean, I hate to put a spanner in the works, but that idea is nonsensical to me. Consider C.S. Lewis's story, The Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe. There was a portal that led to another world, Narnia, I think it was called, which the children found. Yes, Aunt May, but that's a kid's story, I said. It was imaginary. It wasn't true. I don't believe a kid's story is just rooted in a foundation of lies. There has to be truth behind it. I do believe there are portals between worlds. Even psychics tell you of such things, and refer to it as a veil. Well, I don't deny that there may be portals, Aunt May. I'm not disputing that, but I think that what Evangeline is trying to say, my husband interceded, is that maybe there's a rational explanation for what happened to your husband, Ted. And maybe his experience was not paranormal at all. You mean like he was drinking or taking drugs, so he was hallucinating this place of purgatory, piped May. Absolutely not. Ted wasn't even partial to drinking. There are hundreds of things you need to rule out first, before you lay claim to something like the paranormal or outer-worldly. Practical considerations, like your husband's eyesight at the time, or the quality of the torch he was using. How dark was it underground? What about the imagination's incredible ability and extraordinary propensity to blow everything out of proportion, especially in situations driven and compounded by the weight of fear, where we may have an exaggerated impression of things? "What do you mean?" asked May. "Well, let me give you an example," said Roy. "When I was a little boy, I was taken to the sick bay at our school. I was very ill. I began to vomit all over the place. I told the matron that I felt like I was dying because I felt that bad. On my part, it was a magnified or aggrandized expression for how I was feeling. But the horrified, alarmed matron took me at my word quite literally, and promptly informed my parents to come to the sick bay at the school at once, because their boy was dying. My mother was very frantic and said, 'Oh, my goodness, what's wrong?' And the matron said that I was seriously ill and had expressed strong feelings that I did not think I was going to make it. My mother and father promptly dropped everything to race to the school through heavy traffic, and my poor father nearly had a heart attack on the way. My mother was still wearing her hair in curlers and a dressing gown, and was in bare feet when they arrived at the sick bay. I looked at them and smiled and said, 'Are we going home now? My tummy still feels a bit sore.' My mother looked at me and scolded me. 'How dare you scare my life like this, son? I thought you were dying.' And she promptly burst into tears, crying tears of joy and relief. It turned out that the matron had taken me at my word quite literally, thought I was dying based on what I'd told her."
Quite honestly, I have never heard anything so utterly ridiculous in all my born days, said my Aunt May. What a very silly woman. The school should have fired her on the spot for scaring your parents half to death like that. If she thought you were dying, why on earth didn't she call the ambulance? I mean, really, the mind boggles the common sense that some people tend to lack these days. As you can imagine, there was absolutely no point in arguing with Aunt May, who was utterly and totally convinced that in some way there was a passage or portal to hell under her home. But Roy and I were far from persuaded by this preposterous, almost ludicrous allegation. We were very grounded, cynical people that had about as much imagination as a ferret, which pretty much means we had virtually none at all. So one weekend when my aunt went to stay with an old friend for the weekend, we decided to explore the tunnel that my great-uncle's father had built all those years ago. Roy broke open the combination lock with a pickaxe, and we stealthily climbed cautiously down the stairs. It was easy to see why Ted may have felt intimidated, overawed, and exceedingly daunted by this tunnel, as it was incredibly dark and discomposing, and we could barely see our hands before our faces. But even with the dim light of our torch, and coupled by good coordination and nimble feet, we made our way circumspectly down the tunnel, which smelt damp and musty. We walked past silken fibres of fibrous webs, which brushed against our faces like the invisible hands of ghosts. If we had engaged our imaginations or paranoia in full gear, we may have believed the spooky dungeon to be haunted, but Roy and I remained judicious and prudent, refusing to jump to all kinds of conclusions, however disquieting and ghoulish the tunnel might have appeared. To be honest, I would not have been comfortable hiding in this inauspicious location during the wartime. I think I'd rather have taken my chances running above the ground from the Germans. I really don't like it down here. It's so creepy, I told my husband. I don't understand why my uncle's father would build such a foreboding, sinister place. Couldn't he have at least made it a little bit more pleasant and lighter? "You must remember, he lived during a very tumultuous time," said Roy. "It was a daunting, frightening time for people. There was a distinct possibility that America could be dragged into the World War, especially after the Pearl Harbor attack. So I think your uncle's father wanted to ensure your family was very safe. I would describe him as what is known today as a prepper." Even so, I don't like it here. Before long, the passage changed and branched out into a sizable room that was luxuriously covered in deer pelts, that made the floor appear like a thick, luxuriant carpet that had been superbly preserved and smelt of pine cones mixed with body sweat.
In the middle of the room was a fire pit, where large stones had been meticulously arranged in a wide circle, and there were ashes in the circle from an old fire. We could see an area of ventilation where the smoke could leave the room through a hole in the ceiling, which to an outsider might appear as though the ground was indeed smoking. There was a weave basket that was full of hazelnuts, walnuts and chestnuts, which are seasonally fruitful trees on our land, and another basket full of edible mushrooms, roots and tubers, along with a hollow stone containing a wax cone of natural honey. On one of the walls there was an arrangement of eagle's feathers that had been stuck to the wall with a sticky tree resin. It looked like it held some kind of symbolic meaning. There were large tree trunk stumps that were dotted around the room like makeshift chairs, and an area in the room where a neat selection of stones were piled together. As we moved to the end of the room, we came to a concrete step that opened up to a trap door in the ground that was almost identical to the one in the cellar, only much thicker and more robust, possibly designed to withstand the outside elements, all the wear and tear caused from the erosion of wind, hail, rain, sleet or snow. We pushed it open, and it met with some resistance, so we thrust it forcefully harder, and the door bounced open, and we magically found ourselves climbing out of the ground into the heart of the woods. We realised something or someone had covered the door with moss to render it invisible and inconspicuous, so that even a discerning eye would be very unlikely to perceive it, should they happen to be walking in the forest. It was clear several beings were using this underground shelter as a home. All of a sudden we could hear what I can only describe as someone very large ambling towards us, because rustling, crunching noises from heavy footfall was so incredibly substantial that whoever this was appeared weighty, ungainly, cumbersome and excessively bulky in size. We quickly closed the door, covered it with moss, and promptly went and hid behind a large tree, waiting with bated breath to see who or what was coming. Then we saw him, and nothing prepared me for what I was beholding. Even in my wildest, most outlandish imaginings, I could never have envisaged a creature like this existing in our reality, for it was monstrously huge in size, weight and girth, and looked exactly like a giant-sized man, but was completely covered in 4-inch long, shiny, dark brown hair, with the exception of what appeared to be a weathered grey face, which looked exceedingly human, with a beard and a moustache, a very flat, wide nose, and deep-set dark eyes. The critter had overlong arms that I believe could potentially have touched his toes without him needing to bend over, and he had the hugest hands and feet that I've ever seen. I would certainly not describe him as fat. Bulky and burly, yes. Fat, no. He was exceedingly muscular and dense, towering at 9 foot tall, and easily over 800 pounds, and about 3 foot wide across the shoulder area, and the size of those humongous shoulders was quite literally mind-blowing. They were literally titanic. If my husband had not been in my presence, I personally believe I would have fainted with the shock of seeing this thing, as he was so imposing and intimidating. We watched as the critter glided towards the trap door in the ground, and when he arrived at the layers of moss that concealed the door, he thrust them aside with a vigorous sweeping motion with his hefty hand. For a moment he paused and stood very still, while his flat aquatic nose appeared to twitch. Then he bent down and lifted up a piece of moss to his nose and sniffed it, and a look of bewilderment came over his face. And then I discerned that he had definitely smelt us. He lifted up another piece of moss to his face once again, sniffing it carefully, almost as if he was reaffirming to himself what he'd actually smelt. For a second he looked befuddled, and almost appeared to dislike the smell, as he wrinkled his nose with a disgust look, as though he was smelling something vile. I was to learn later that many people of colour think that white people smell exactly like wet dog. If that is what we smell like to him, only 1,000 times worse, given that I established he has a remarkable sense of smell, we must smell pretty bad. I watched him examining the ground, as though looking for footprints, and that was when my level of anxiety escalated. Please God, I prayed, don't let him see us. The critter glanced around the forest, with eyes that almost seemed to scan the area with an X-ray vision. I stood incredibly still. I do not recall a time in my life when I was more petrified, and there are no words that can do any justice to the level of terror that I experienced. Indeed, it was so profound, I doubt that if the critter had spotted me, I would have even been capable of running away. Of that I am most sure. I could see the critter's gaze directed towards the trees, where we were hiding, with a pinpoint accuracy, and his eyes remained fixed on our hiding spot. My heart began pounding violently in my chest, and my hands were sweating profusely. The critter turned around, put a little stone near the door, and then replaced the moss over the outside of it, while slipping inside and closing it behind him. I've never felt so relieved in all my life. But my husband and I continued to wait for a while, and then we made our way back home, without saying a single word. Finally I said to my husband, "What in God's name was that?" "I have no idea," said my husband. "But whatever it is, it's as real as you and I think I can finally establish what happened with your great-uncle all those years ago. I believe the man stumbled down a dark passage, brushing against cobwebs, while seeing rats scampering past him, a seemingly ominous prelude for what was to come. We know he smelt something awful, which he would mentally have associated with a hellish domain. He entered a large room, and all he could see were these dark, shadowy figures, which possibly fit the description of what we have just seen ourselves. I imagine he encountered a family of these beings, which he mistook for demons. Easy to do, for the red eyes were possibly red eyeshine, which occurs with nocturnal animals, and in the dark those creatures would be very frightening. Perhaps they were stoking up a fire on a cold night. I can only conclude your uncle's mind exaggerated what he was discerning. One of the creatures screamed at him and began to follow him down the passage, breathing heavily, causing your uncle to conclude that he was being pursued by a demon. Oh my goodness, Roy, you're absolutely right. You've got it in a nutshell. That's exactly what happened. And so it was we established that there were a few of these outlandish creatures living under our home in an air raid shelter that my great-uncle's father had built during the Second World War. Roy and I naturally never told Aunt May what we'd uncovered, nor did we tell her about our peculiar experience with a humanoid creature that I established many years later to be a Bigfoot. I'm glad to tell you that Great-Aunt May lived a full life, and one night in 1993, when she was 94 years old, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep, fulfilling her wishes of breathing her last breath in her own home. It was an honour living with such a wizened soul, whose vast wealth of knowledge and discernment enriched our lives and taught us much. In the years that followed, my husband and I raised 4 young children who have long since left home. But growing up, there were random, fleeting sightings of Bigfoot activity on our land, and even today I discern soft moss over the trap door that leads me to believe that generations of Bigfoot have lived in that underground air raid shelter. There have been times on icy winter days that smoke has been seen rising from the ground, which I know is Bigfoot having a fire in the underground shelter, and it has always made me smile, as I believe the creatures want to live in peace and mean us no harm. My youngest daughter Raven had an experience once where she was playing out in the woods, and describes a very tall, hairy creature watching her from behind a tree. She is my only daughter, who appears to be more sensitive to otherworldly phenomena. Raven was fearless on seeing the creature and waved at it, and she said it waved back to her, moved away from the tree, and watched her as she returned to the house. She said to me, "Mummy, it was so beautiful." I asked her why it was beautiful. "Its eyes," she explained. "They were so kind." When Raven was 3 years old, she always asked us who the nice old lady in our house was, who wore her white hair in a bun, and visited our house from time to time. All these years later, I've pondered whether she was seeing Aunt May. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Nicholas, although everybody calls me Nick for short. I was born and raised in the vibrant, bustling city of New York, and I grew up in a glamorous apartment block in a secluded private area with lots of tall oak trees and close to an exquisitely beautiful park. I was raised exclusively by my mother, who had fallen pregnant with me at 16 years old, much to her parents' horror and bitter disappointment. My mother revealed to me that she will never forget how her own mother looked at her with a mixture of disgusted revulsion and disapproval on her face, and said to her own daughter, "You have disgraced yourself, you little harlot. You've completely ruined your life. You'll never amount to anything now. You've behaved with such deplorable recklessness." While her father, who could barely bring himself to look at her because of the shame he felt, told her that he was ashamed to call her his daughter because he didn't expect any child of his to be as loose as a female rabbit, with the morals of an alley cat. Both her parents tirelessly begged, pressurized, and henpecked her to terminate the pregnancy, and even added bribery to the equation by offering her money to get rid of me. But my mother held her ground like a powerful ship with a strong anchor that refused to be shifted from its mooring place. My mother claims that her younger brother Marcus was her complete rock, and he said to her, "Sis, there's nothing you can do to make me love you less, and I will always have your back, and support you 1,000% in having this baby." And he was true to his word. The universe has a remarkably good sense of humour, and life has a funny, rather peculiar way of coming back to bite you in the face, as the irony of all ironies is that soon after I was born, both my grandparents did a complete 180 and began to boast to everybody about their incredible newborn grandson. It would seem that they shouted from the rooftops that they were the proud grandparents of an adorable little baby boy, and rushed around buying me hundreds of cute blue little outfits, insisting on babysitting at every given opportunity. I very soon became the apple of their eye, and if you were to ever suggest to them that they wanted my mother to terminate her pregnancy with me, they would have denied it profusely and probably said, "Don't talk such nonsense. Where did you get that strange idea from?" While my mother loves her parents enormously, she never forgot how they wanted her to get rid of me, which was something she found difficult to accept or even comprehend. My mother said she was so devastated by her parents' complete disregard for her feelings during the most tumultuous, lonely, and very challenging time in her life, when she could well have done with her parents' support. Instead, she felt their cold, brutal, unkind words had hit her so hard, like a bullet being plunged into the guts. I have no idea who my father was, as unfortunately I was conceived by a mysterious stranger as a result of a party my mother had attended. She was young, naive, immature and gullible at the time, and it was her first time to have really experimented with alcohol. And on this particular occasion she became completely bladdered and utterly sozzled. My mother was always honest with me about what transpired, and I truly respected her for being so truthful. "I'm really ashamed," she told me once. "I take full responsibility for what I did. I vaguely remember I had several drinks at that party, and I didn't know my own limitations and went completely overboard with the alcohol. I remember feeling dizzy and disorientated, and I was giggling so much, as everything seemed so terribly funny, and I lost all my inhibitions. I have very hazy, foggy, rather disturbing memories of going back with the boy to his apartment for a drink, and then I woke up in the morning to find myself lying completely naked in a stranger's bed, in a part of New York I was not even remotely acquainted with. I remember looking at the stranger lying on the pillow next to me with horror and thinking, "Who the hell is this?" I began freaking out and tiptoeing around the strange boy's apartment, where I felt like an imposter, as I had no memory of the previous evening whatsoever. I was furious with myself for being so incoherent that all my memories were fuzzy and hazy. I don't believe I was deliberately drugged. I just think I drank way too much. I hurriedly began to get dressed and bolted out of the stranger's apartment as fast as I possibly could. I felt such a sense of loathing and self-disgust. When I was out in the street, I didn't even know where I was, as all the streets and buildings were so unfamiliar to me. And then weeks later, I discovered to my horror that I was pregnant with you. My mother lovingly took me into her arms after that explanation, and told me that she didn't regret anything, because if I had not got completely plastered that night, I may never have had you, and that would be a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. But I do have one big regret, and that is that I have no knowledge of who your father is, and for that reason I feel I failed you. I remember saying to my mother, "Let me down? Are you crazy? If you hadn't made a big mistake, I would never have been born." And so my mother always used to joke that I was the best mistake that she ever made. In the end, my mother had proved her parents completely wrong about not amounting to anything, as she ran a very successful art gallery in New York and became a dazzling success in high-flying New York circles, where people in the art community knew my mother exceedingly well. And she earned a phenomenal reputation for her incredible ability to find undiscovered talent, which in itself is a huge skill. Growing up, I'd wanted for nothing, so I did indeed have a privileged and very blessed childhood. One day when I was 16 years old, my Uncle Marcus, who was my mother's brother, was going away for a week. He told us that he was going on a camping trip to the Cascade Mountains in Washington with a lifelong friend of his called Oliver. They both fancied a wild adventure, but my mother warned them with words of foreboding to be careful what you wish for. Little did all parties realise that we would all have the most idiosyncratic, inexplicable and unorthodox week that would ultimately leave us all questioning our own reality and would turn our view of the world on its head. My Uncle Marcus had asked me if I would house-sit his two very overweight tabby cats at his apartment, and I agreed to the job, as long as I could bring along a friend, of course. I was thrilled to be spending a week in his luxurious, high-living, self-indulgent apartment with my best friend Freddie, and we were as excited as young 16-year-olds to have the place to ourselves. What was there not to like, especially as his apartment had a jacuzzi, a sauna, and a top-of-the-range Bang & Olufsen musical centre. Before long we'd settled into the sumptuous, affluent apartment on a high elevation, and for its day it was cutting edge, and was exceedingly stylish, masculine, and elegantly fitted with classic but comfortable furnishings. The apartment possessed floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a very opulent, fashionable and petite pretty courtyard, with a cascading fountain, and a terraced yard, interlaced with alternating squares of grass and sandstone tiles, along with perfectly manicured hedgings, and hundreds of white roses bursting with blossoms. Directly opposite my uncle's apartment was another identical apartment block, with equally as large windows, so in effect you could look directly into the strangers' apartments if they did not close their curtains or blinds, but to be fair, you were unlikely to see much with your natural eyes. However, in one of my uncle's bedrooms, he had a tripod and a telescope that he used on his boat, but being naturally nosy and inquisitive by nature, and 16-year-old boys that were fascinated by avant-garde, innovative gadgets, we decided to place the novel, very high-tech telescope into the living area and peek through it and see if we could see into other people's apartments. I am a little bashful to admit that it was fun to spy on other people, and we were hoping to see if we could spot some attractive young woman dressed in some lacy lingerie, but fate was not kind to us. Instead, we observed a rather nerdy-looking lanky young man playing a guitar in one of the top apartments, which was pretty boring. And then there was a romantic elderly couple dancing to some music, which was rather endearing. It looked like they were celebrating something, possibly a wedding anniversary together, and truly they looked as if they were still very much in love. Then in the apartment directly opposite us, we saw something compelling that certainly engaged our attention. And the only way that I can describe it to you is watching a movie unfold before our very eyes. A very striking woman, possibly in her early 30s, with long dark hair, wearing a bright red figure-hugging evening dress with shoestring straps, appeared to be drinking red wine with her partner, and they were clinking their glasses together as if celebrating. They were both laughing and having what seemed like a very enjoyable time together. All of a sudden, while she was talking to him on their leather sofa with an earnest, sincere expression on her face, I could see the man's smile shift downwards into a scowl, and his previously adoring eyes darkened with rage. I watched him stand up and throw a huge glass vase of roses across the apartment, and I could see the glass shatter and the roses fly across the room. It was very dramatic. The man was oscillating his arms in gestures of angry defiance, and it was clear he was shouting loudly. so much so that the woman became frightened by his outburst. She pulled off her silver stiletto shoe and began hitting him with it in the chest. The man was furious, and the expression on his face became very violent and enraged, and he grabbed her around the shoulders and began to shake her very vigorously. And then he wrapped his very large hands around her tiny neck and began to strangle her. And Freddie and I were beside ourselves with horror. Could this really be happening in front of our eyes, we wondered. Oh my goodness, he's murdering the woman! Oh my goodness, he's murdering her! I shouted in horror. Sure enough, the man squeezed her neck so hard, and then her eyes rolled in the back of her head, and blood burst forth in her sockets, and then she lost consciousness, and her body fell backwards in his arms, and became limp. We realized without a shadow of a doubt that she was dead, and in our dumbfounded state, we just stared and stared as we watched the man run frantically around the apartment and drag her body across the floor by her arms and roll her in the carpet, dragging the carpet across the floor. On sensing he was being watched, the man looked up in our direction and saw us looking at him through the telescope with a look of murderous rage on his face. He quickly pulled the blinds across his windows to block our view. "Oh my goodness!" cried Freddie in distress. "He saw us watching him! What should we do? Supposing he comes after us? He knows exactly where we live." I remember my heart was pounding violently in my chest, and I was terrified. Freddie and I were eyewitnesses to a murder, yet at the very same time we were reluctant to go to the police and admit that we'd been spying on the apartments opposite us with a telescope, as that would make us look like a couple of perverse peeping toms. On the other hand, we knew that we could not allow this duplicitous man to get away with murder, and I knew Freddie was right. What if the man came after us to eliminate his witnesses? The following day we decided to report what we'd seen to the police, and we nervously made our way to the station, very reluctant to make our report. Imagine our surprise when we discovered that the policeman who was questioning us knew the apartment opposite us exceedingly well, for it had been vacant for over 2 years, as no one stayed in that apartment for very long, due to ongoing reports of paranormal activity, where they claimed to have heard a woman's desperate screams, and vases of flowers were often broken, while lights would switch on and off on their own accord, and tenants walking through the courtyard would swear that they could see a figure in their apartment, and would often call the police, and a search was usually conducted, but no one was ever found there. Indeed, the landlord had so many complaints with the apartment that he refused to let it out, as within a week the tenants would ultimately leave, complaining of strange outer-worldly experiences. The policeman who took down our report was very intrigued by our story. "I want you to tell Officer McLeod exactly what you told me," he said. "He has retired from the force, but I'll give him a call, and I think he will be intrigued to hear your story, for he dealt with this case in the 70s. When the retired officer, an elderly man with a white beard, white moustache and blue eyes, heard our report, his eyes grew as round as saucers, and his mouth hung open in astonishment. He then proceeded to open up an old file, and began to show us photographs of the inside of the apartment, and separate photographs of a woman with dark hair, and a man that both looked uncannily familiar. "Is this who you saw?" he asked us, gravely watching the expressions on our face metamorphosized from curious to astonished. "That's her," I said to the officer. "That's the woman we saw being strangled last night. And that's the man that strangled her." "What's going on?" I asked, looking at the files suspiciously. "These photographs look very old." "That's because they are," said the retired officer, looking befuddled, and rubbing his white moustache awkwardly. "The murder you describe," he said, "happened over 12 years ago, in the 1970s. "What?" I said. "But we both witnessed it last night. I don't understand. None of this makes any sense to us at all." "We know what we saw," piped Freddie. "It happened last night, sir. And we're not making this up, sir. It was the most horrifying thing we've ever seen. And if you're implying, sir, that we were seeing ghosts, well, you're very wrong. The murderer became quite angst when he saw us watching him and promptly drew the blinds. "I believe you, son," said the officer. "Your accounts of the murder are startlingly accurate. You were most certainly, without a doubt, eyewitnesses to it. But what you beheld happened a very long time ago. I think you must have glimpsed a glitch into our reality, when a scene from another time was being replayed back in our time, almost like a video recording. And the strangest thing of all was the man I arrested who confessed to the crime did acknowledge that 2 kids in the opposite apartment had witnessed him murdering his wife through a telescope." Freddie and I looked at each other in astonishment. "But, sir, we are from 12 years in the future," I piped. "How could that even be remotely possible?" "Maybe you were looking from a tear of the page of your time into a page of his time, and he saw you through that tear." "I wish I knew the answers, son," said the retired officer. "I've worked in the police force over 40 years, and I've seen things during my time that would make your hair curl, because they make no sense at all, and they can only be described as paranormal, for there are no earthly explanations for them whatsoever. I assure you, many officers experience strange things on their call, but they never tell anyone about, for fear of being ridiculed. In my experience, traumatic events like murders, wars, car accidents and disasters seem to leave an imprint or an impression on the landscape, like a video or a photograph." "Why did the man kill the lady in the red dress, sir?" I asked. "I gather she confessed to him that although she'd fallen pregnant, the baby might not be his, because in an unguarded moment, when she got very drunk, she had slept with his brother. It would seem that upon hearing this horrifying revelation, he flew off the handle into a violent rage and promptly strangled her, disposing of her body by rolling her up in the carpet and burying her in a wooded area. A few days later, he couldn't live with his guilt and promptly handed himself over to the police and took them to the woods to recover the body, which was in a remarkably good condition, although it did not smell very nice, of course. The coroner was able to establish that the woman was 8 weeks pregnant, which meant that it was definitely not the brother's baby after all. When the woman's husband heard the bad news, he was found hanging in his police cell. It was all very tragic. Many officers were very aware of the case." "Wow," I said. "That's the saddest story I've ever heard. I know how accidents happen, sir, and how people make mistakes that they regret. Do you know, sir, I was a result of an accident, and my mother doesn't even know who my father is. I think the man should have forgiven his wife. As alcohol, sir, it can make us do very crazy things when we're not thinking straight. In the end, it was his own baby anyway." "You're not wrong about that, son," said the retired officer. "Alcohol causes many problems, more than you can ever imagine. I was witness to that myself when I was working on the force, first hand, as you can imagine. When you abuse alcohol, it isn't your friend. It causes accidents, tragedies and disasters, and when abused, can make us behave out of character." For the next couple of days, my friend Freddie and I kept our telescope pinned on the opposite apartment, and we were astonished and perturbed to see that the officers were absolutely right, and that the unfurnished apartment was completely empty, yet we had seen it fully furnished. We were fixated on the apartment, and we watched it for ages and ages, hoping that we might witness the scene being replayed over again, but we never did, as the apartment remained empty. A couple of days later, my uncle returned from his camping trip 4 days earlier than was expected with his friend Oliver. They had taken a flight from Washington to New York, and by the state of them both, I knew something quite horrific had happened. My uncle is one of the most laid-back, easy-going people I know, and he and Oliver have known each other for many years. I have never seen them so rattled before, and they made a beeline to the alcohol cabinet and proceeded to dive into the brandy, with far too much gusto for my liking, and so I immediately intervened and locked the alcohol cabinet so that they would not become completely plastered. "Son, we need more drink," my uncle virtually begged me. "You don't understand. We've had one hell of a shock." "Sorry," I said, "but you can't have any more drink. It's not a good idea, Uncle Marcus. What on earth is the matter with the both of you? I've never seen you look so shaken and discomposed." "Believe me, son," he said. "You'll never believe me if I told you." "I think we would believe you," piped Freddie, "because something happened to us that is so enigmatic, bizarre, preposterous and incongruous and out of the realms of our reality that I think the cynic in me is inclined to believe the most outlandish of claims. You could tell us that aliens had landed and moved in next door to you, and we might believe you. So why don't you try us? I think you might be pleasantly surprised." "Very well," said my uncle. "I will tell you our story. As you can imagine, Oliver and I were having a wonderful time at the Cascades, with lots of hiking and fishing, and everything was going swimmingly. We both felt so relaxed and invigorated by the trip, and I was deeply involved in reading my second murder mystery, and it was very good. It was on the third night of our camping trip that things began to change for us. Oliver and I decided to camp in this wooded clearing overlooking a pretty lake adjacent to a flowery prairie. It was such an exquisite night, as the silvery stars and the almost full moon were reflected on the shimmering lake, along with the imposing statuesque silhouettes of the mountain and the towering clusters of spruce, Douglas firs and Engelmann pines. It was so breathtakingly beautiful, and we were beguiled and bedazzled by the scenic resplendence. We could hear the chorus of crickets and frogs serenade us while we happily cooked our fresh fish we'd caught earlier on in the day, and it was melt-in-the-mouth delicious. We sat back on our camping chairs and enjoyed drinking in the fabulous scenery, like a large, exotic, alcoholic cocktail. Then all of a sudden the atmosphere changed, almost as if someone had flicked off a light, and it was quite literally that instantaneous and rapid, the transformation, I mean. "What do you mean, atmosphere changed?" I asked. "Well, the chorus of crickets and frogs just dissipated, and we could sense a foreboding presence that sent chills down our spine, and we had the bothersome, unnerving and confounding feeling that we were most certainly being watched." I said to Oliver, "Are you feeling what I'm feeling?" And he nodded uncomfortably and whispered, "We're being scrutinized. Something doesn't want us here. And whatever it is, it feels hauntingly predacious and very bewildering." We scanned our environment with binoculars, as it was a rather luminescent bright night, but we saw nothing, and we tried to reassure ourselves that we were imagining things, but we could not shake that ominous spine-chilling feeling that we had both experienced. I'm not going to kid. I was feeling terrified, and I clung tightly to my rifle and lay on my sleeping bag in a state of nervous anxiety, and I was sweating so profusely. That's how unsettled I became. Then all of a sudden, the airy, oppressive feeling just lifted, and we could hear the crickets and frogs again, and we began to feel rather silly, as if we'd just overreacted, and we both happily fell into a deep sleep. In a trice, I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag and woke Oliver up, because I suddenly smelt the most odorous smell that was so revolting it made me want to hurl violently. It was a sulphurous smell that reminded me of rotting eggs or decomposing flesh. It was utterly revolting and very, very rank. Then I heard a rustling sound, like leaves and twigs and stones being crunched by heavy footfall. That became increasingly louder as they approached our tent, although I do not think the intruder was trying to be noisy. He was trying to be quiet, but with very little success. And when I say heavy footfall, I mean you knew something very sizable was in your vicinity. Then I heard grunting and breathing heavily, much like that of a horse, directly outside our tent, almost as if our presence was being investigated. "Oh, I nearly had a cardiac arrest when I discerned the shape of a heavy fist pressing into the fabric of our tent, and I was so spooked my hair stood up on end, and I broke up in goosebumps all over my skin. We heard the footfall walking away, and that was when I foolishly crept to the door of my tent and peered out, clutching my rifle tightly in my hands. "Come back," whispered Oliver to me. "Don't do anything stupid." But I didn't listen, as I needed to see who or what our intruder was. I could see the dark, shadowy silhouette of something monstrously huge gliding away. But the moment I looked out of my tent, this creature's head, along with his Herculean shoulders, swiveled around, and I could see these menacing red eyes staring at me from 8 foot off the ground. And then, piped Oliver, your uncle did a very stupid thing, and he unloaded his rifle in the direction of the critter, and came running back into the tent with a frightened red face and eyes growing as round as saucers, and in that moment I pretty much knew we were both dead, because I'm certain Marcus provoked that creature to a rage. "Let me finish, Oliver," said my uncle. "I'm the one telling the story, unless you want to." "Yes, I do, as it happens. You've had your turn. Let me finish." "All right, very well." Well, the next thing we heard was what sounded like a rhino charging our tent, but everything happened so fast. We had absolutely no time to react, much like when you're in a car accident. It's a situation that is out of your control, but you know that the outcome might not be good. Our whole tent was literally ripped off the ground with such a brute force, and we were lifted up in our tents and flung violently into the water by this Herculean beast. "You are kidding," I gasped. "You mean he threw you both, in your tents, into the depths of the lake?" "That's exactly what I mean," said Oliver. "Now you know why I wanted the brandy so desperately. You don't forget an ordeal like that in a hurry." "How could anything be that strong?" I piped. "I mean, throwing you both rolled up in the fabric of your tent into the depths of the water seems nonsensical and utterly bizarre. Surely the two of you alone would weigh easily over 400 pounds. Now that is heavy." "Well, this thing," said my uncle, interceding, "it was built like a bodybuilder, muscular, stocky and ripped. It had a cone-shaped head with a human face and exceedingly long arms, and it was covered in very long hair. I think it must have been 9 foot tall and easily 800 pounds. It was hell of a strong." "So what happened when you were flung into the water?" Oliver continued the conversation. "Well, I rolled on top of your poor uncle, nearly squashing him half to death. And the next thing I know is the critter had scrunched the tent together, rather like an oversized bag, and hurled us into the water. But luckily the tent opened, and with a little tugging we found our way to the surface, and the cold water was a brutal shock to the system. We made sure that we swam to the other side of the lake as quickly as we could, and by the time we reached a clearing, we were shivering and shaking. We were so cold. We were very fortunate to come upon a camping site where we were given a change of clothes by some friendly, kind campers, and we made up a fictitious story that we were camping with friends on our bachelor party, and we were both getting married to twin sisters in the morning, and had been thrown into the water by all our friends as a big joke. They laughed and said, 'Thank God we don't have friends like you do.'" "Wow, that was an excellent story to make up," I said. "Clever thinking on your part." Luckily we left our wallets and everything of significance in the car we'd hired, which was safely parked in the parking bay. So we drove to the airport at lightning speed, and here we are a couple of hours later, now still trying to process what the heck happened to us, and what in God's name that strange creature was that we encountered. After Oliver had finished telling us the incredulous story, we told them ours, and my uncle was absolutely astounded. "You are joking," he said. "Are you saying that no one lives in that apartment directly opposite us? I often see lights going on and off there, and the blinds are never ever closed." "That's right," I said. "That's because it's empty, and it's been that way for 2 years, according to the retired officer we spoke to." "Well, I have seen the figure of a woman in a red dress," said my uncle, "but it was too far away to see her clearly, because unlike you, I don't go prying on strangers with my telescope." "That's freaky," I said. "She died 12 years ago, so you've seen her ghost too." "Well, I am surprised," said my uncle. "I'm seriously beginning to question my reality. I'm now wondering what is real and what is not." "Join the club," I said. For many years my Uncle Marcus experienced post-traumatic stress disorder from that camping event, but after counselling and hypnotherapy, he no longer lives in fear. But we all know now that the mysterious creature he saw, without question, fits the profile of a Bigfoot. But in those days we could only ponder on what it was that they had both seen. Ola believes that my uncle made a grave and foolish mistake firing at the creature, as he thinks the creature was just checking them out, driven by curiosity and intrigue. It would seem that after my Uncle Marcus fired some warning shots after the Bigfoot, it became furiously enraged and reacted adversely to a situation that could have potentially not ended well for the both of them. Looking back, it was so extraordinary that during the same very week, we both experienced what would forever make us question everything we thought we knew about the natural world. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was a beautiful crisp Saturday morning in the early summer of 1992, and the radiant sunshine filtered through the kitchen, enveloping the room in a vibrant warm light. I glanced out of the large windows that overlook panoramic exquisite views of the verdant green countryside, generously clustered with Douglas firs and ponderosa pines, to see if I could see any signs of my husband, but he was nowhere to be seen. Where had Peter got to, I wondered? Why on earth was he taking so long? I knew he was at the stable block attending to our 5 horses and leading them out to the horses' meadow, along with our 8 sheep and 4 billy goats, which had a meadow all to themselves, as we did indeed have quite a menagerie of animals on our quaint little hobby farm. I bustled around the kitchen of our Cape Cod-style home, making pancakes for breakfast with blueberry and cinnamon compote, and the delicious smells wafted around our home, alerting my daughter's hunger pangs to the revelation that something quite good was cooking on the hob. In a trice, Sandra bolted into the kitchen and began diving into the pancakes with the enthusiastic gusto of a hungry 12-year-old girl who had a bottomless pit for a stomach and in any given time could eat 12 pancakes in a single sitting, yet annoyingly still remained as skinny as a rake. I was looking forward to the day ahead of us, as there was going to be a rather grandiose, spectacular fete at my daughter's school, of which the whole town was likely to attend, and I was being put in charge of the candy store, and I was looking forward to the excursion, which was a great opportunity to see my friends again. "Have you packed all the fudge away for the school fete?" my daughter asked me. "Yes, I have, and it's all in cellophane with pretty little ribbons attached, and I've labelled it Sandra's Fudge so that you can get all the acclaim for it." "Thanks, Mum," said Sandra. "You're the best, and so is your fudge. I can't wait for the fete today. Mrs. Pennington believes the whole town will be coming." "I think she's absolutely right," I said. "After all, it is a charity event, and so I can't imagine that anyone will be staying at home. And besides, there's so much to do, from jumping castles to merry-go-rounds and all kinds of exciting rides. Personally, I love the exciting stores, selling things from the baked goods to the cakes, candies, cheeses, chutneys and preserves, not to mention those cooking demonstrations. My word, the chef last year, he was brilliant. Do you remember those incredible praline crepes he made? He was a superstar. Well, word on the grapevine is that one of America's finest chefs will be doing some amazing demonstrations on how to make the world's tastiest burgers. He's going to let us in on some of his culinary secrets. "Well, I'm definitely going to watch that," I admitted. "I wouldn't mind a little culinary inspiration. My burgers could do with a little bit of jazzing up." At that moment the kitchen door flung open, and I could see my husband in his Wellington boots coming into the kitchen with a broad beam on his face, looking a little flustered and energised from his brief stint outdoors. "Ooh, something smells delicious," he said, walking over to the kitchen sink to wash his hands and dry them. "It's a beautiful day out there, a lovely day for a fete. But you know, Washington, we can have 4 seasons in one day here. So here's hoping the weather holds. Please God, let it not rain." "I also hope the weather stays fixed like this," I laughed. "Let's just keep the fingers crossed, shall we?" The shrill sound of the telephone broke the peaceful ambience as it rang, and my husband promptly went to answer it. "It's for you," he said, handing the handset over to me, which I took reluctantly from him, placing it to my ear. Who was it now, I thought, really irritated by this abrupt intrusion on our special family time that I so enjoyed, as family breakfasts, especially over the weekends, were always very special to me. "Hello, Judith Maynard speaking." "Hello, Judith. How are you? It's Shane Farrell speaking." "I'm fine, thank you. And you?" "Well, I was just wondering how the painting's coming along. I'm so looking forward to picking it up this Tuesday. Oh, it's going to be the best golden anniversary ever for us. I know my husband is going to be blown away by your work. I'm so looking forward to seeing the piece. It must be breathtaking." I stumbled on my words. "You mean the picture for your golden anniversary? The Black Panther?" "That's right, the very one. How's it coming along, dear? I bet it looks sensational. I do not think my husband is going to believe that I got Shadow, our favourite Black Panther, painted in colour, lying on our couch at home, larger than life, in a fabulous piece of artwork." "It's coming along very nicely," I lied. "It really looks stunning." "Oh, I know it does. I'm glad to hear it. I can't wait to pick it up on Tuesday afternoon. What time will suit you best?" 3 o'clock will be good," I said. "Right, see you then. Can't wait. Bye." I put down the handset, my face growing as white as a sheet, and my eyes staring vacantly into space. I could hardly believe it. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" asked my husband, his mouth crammed full of pancake. "You look as if you've seen a ghost." "I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to come to the fete today. You'll have to take over my candy stand, Peter. I'm sorry to have to do this to you at the last moment, but I really haven't got an option." "What's happened? Is everything all right? Nothing wrong with your father?" "Not really. You know that art piece that I was commissioned to do for next month? Well, it seems I got the dates completely wrong. I honestly don't know how that happened. It must be some kind of misunderstanding or screw-up on my part. Oh dear, it seems a woman wants the art piece for Tuesday afternoon. That's for her husband's golden anniversary. I can hardly tell her that I haven't even started the work. It would break her heart." My husband gasped. "But can you finish an artwork in 3 days?" "Well, I'm going to have to, aren't I? I haven't really got a choice in the matter. This is a golden anniversary we're talking about. How can I possibly let the poor woman down?" "Does that mean you're not coming to the fete?" asked my daughter. "Oh, that's such a bummer. You'll be the only one in town still at home, as everybody's going." "Well, that's the way it'll have to be, sweetheart. I'm desperately sorry, I really am. I wish I could change things. Please will you make my apologies to the local mothers and explain my reasoning behind my absence?" "They will understand, sweetheart," my husband said, planting an affectionate kiss on my cheek. "All will be well, I promise you. And I'm quite partial to running a candy store, especially if a few pieces of your delicious fudge will come my way," he said, giving me a big wink. My heart sank as I watched Peter pack the car trunk with the large baskets of my homemade fudge that I'd made the previous evening. He waved at me and got into his vehicle with my daughter, and I watched them as they drove away down the long gravel driveway. How I wished I could be with them. I needed to get my act together as far as the art commission was concerned, as I had a prominent reputation in the art world, and I was always being booked to produce either contemporary or realistic art pieces, sometimes for offices, corporate firms or individuals with a specific idea in mind that they wanted recreating, and to date I had been incredibly happy with my work, as indeed had all my customers, up to now that is. Finally, after dressing in my art clothes, which consisted of a loose flowing white cotton blouse and a pair of comfortable white cotton pants, I closed the front door behind me and proceeded towards my studio, which was situated close to the bottom of the drive, adjacent to a vast wooded area of tall statuesque Douglas firs on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side was the enchanting evergreen meadow with white wooden poled fencing and an inverted gate inbuilt into the structure, where the sheep and goats were grazing. I could hear the pretty sounds of the goats' bells tinkling as they moved across the grass, a nostalgic sound that always reminded me of a visit to the Swiss Alps I had as a young girl. I opened my studio door and pulled out the canvas that I'd thankfully long since prepared for in advance for this particular commission, as the qualities of my tools was very significant for me when it comes to producing good work. The canvas was a very long, narrow, big square piece that the woman intended to hang in pride of place above the settee in her living room, opposite her marble fireplace. Why a black panther, I'd asked her. Well, when my husband and I were on honeymoon in Malaysia, we both found what looked like an abandoned black kitten in the wild, which we rescued and we took to a local vet in the area. It turned out that this pretty little black kitten was a black panther, but you could never tell the difference. It was the cutest, most interactive kitten that I've ever seen. It was adorable, a real bundle of joy. We organised for the poor little orphaned panther to be taken to a private, well-established sanctuary in Malaysia, where she would have a good life and lots of space to roam freely in the wild. We would send money to the sanctuary every single year, and in turn the sanctuary would send us exquisite pictures of this black panther, and we became fixated and enamoured by her. We called her Shadow. She was the most exquisitely beautiful cat that I've ever seen, with these mesmerising green eyes. We sometimes went over to Malaysia to see her. Of course she's no longer alive, but she has descendants living there at the sanctuary. I want to give my husband a picture of Shadow lying sprawled across our large sofa so that she can always be here with us in spirit. I have brought a picture of our living room and a picture of Shadow for you to copy with a touch of your artistic licence and savoir-faire, of course, which will take the painting to a whole new level, as they say. Wow, she is a magnificent cat, I had agreed, eyeing the picture with awe and feeling a rising sense of excitement in my heart, as I knew I was going to really enjoy this commission. I'd always been rather partial to black panthers with their large, sultry green eyes. I think it's their elusive reticence that adds to their mystique and appeal. I placed the canvas on the easel facing the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rich, resplendent meadows, as I enjoyed glancing out at the exquisite country views. Somehow, as a working artist, I drew so much of my inspiration from nature, and that includes colours, textures, shapes and forms that would enhance my imagination to come up with ideas that sometimes were so remarkable that they even surprised me. I could see our sheep and goats with their dangling bells grazing happily together in the fields. Sometimes I think they thought they were the same creatures, even though they were so different. And I smiled to myself. There was something so relaxing about watching animals graze that always brought a feeling of peaceful serenity to my heart. Before long I was getting into my work with a zealous passion, and I surprised myself with how quickly it was coming together. And the mesmerising greenish eyes of this illustrious cat were staring back at me on the canvas, and looked so remarkably real that it sent a pleasurable chill down my spine, something that often happened to me when I resonated with my own work. I could see the black panther so clearly and visibly in my mind's eye, almost as if she'd been teleported to my studio and was coming to life, almost like a 3D manifestation, if you like, or a hologram. That was how I managed to capture her on the canvas. I was so lost in my work that time melted away like the butter on a hot cross bun, and I forgot about the fate as I became so absorbed and entrenched in my art. It can sometimes be all-consuming. All of a sudden I could hear an animal trailer truck used for carrying livestock driving up my driveway, crunching the gravel beneath heavy tyres and stopping short at the gate that led into the pasture where my sheep and goats were grazing. "Who is this?" I thought, feeling very annoyed. I stealthily ventured over to the window with my paintbrush still in hand, glancing out, and I was left gobsmacked and appalled by what I was perceiving. What the heck were these strangers doing, I pondered. Why were they on my property? I watched in horror as they let down the ramp of their trailer, and that was when I had a horrible, nauseating impression that these men were planning to steal my farm animals in broad daylight, but that was fortunately not to be the case. Instead, these strapping, muscular young men appeared to be carrying what looked like a very hefty, massive cloud down the ramp, one on either side of it, almost as if they were carrying a table. That suggested to me that this cloud-like structure, whatever it was exceedingly weighty. They glided up the ramp, returning 2 more times, transporting 2 more of these dirty, woolly blobs, which they simply plonked down in the middle of my field, almost as if they were delivering huge bales of hay to me. I was so bewildered and nonplussed that I stood there in a bemused silence, watching everything unfold before my eyes, like a curious nonsensical movie, which was so incredibly bizarre. What on earth was going on, I wondered. To my amazement, the men proceeded to get back into their truck, but I did happen to overhear one say, "Imagine the shock when they get home. Love to be a fly on the wall to see their shocked reactions." "Me too," said the other. "It'll be hilarious." At that, they promptly drove away. Who were these strange men, and what were they up to? Were they setting me up for some kind of hoax, I wondered. I had never seen them before a day in my life because they weren't remotely familiar to me, and I was well acquainted with most of the locals in our town. I glanced down briefly at the floor and realised with surprise that my paintbrush had fallen out of my hand, and I quickly leant down to pick it up and glanced up at the meadow again. And what I was about to see next I have never been able to forget, for indeed it has left an indelible blueprint on my memory that can never ever be erased as long as I shall live. For out of the shadows, moving through the Douglas fir trees across our gravel drive, with the stealth, dignity, elegance and masterful agility of a black panther, and gliding over the wooden pole fence as if it were a mere piece of turf, was a dark, shadowy form, such as the likes that I've never ever seen before. I crept over to the bookcase surreptitiously and grabbed my binoculars to focus on this strange peculiarity that was even more preposterous than the weird clouds that had been dumped on the meadow. It was hard to focus on the critter, for indeed my hands were trembling and wobbling so much, with a mixture of wondrous awe, excitement and extreme trepidation. Finally I managed to compose my nervous energy and focused on the critter, who was standing yards away from one of the massive clouds, with an expression of extreme bewilderment and intrigued curiosity on his face, as if he was trying to fathom and ascertain what on earth this cloud was. I'm not exaggerating by any manner of means when I say that this imposing, lofty creature was built like a man in shape and form, but he was covered in long, flowing black hair that was as black as a panther's and exceedingly shiny. I discerned that his head merged from his huge shoulders rather like a sizable arch, but there appeared to be no visible neck. The creature's hairless, leathery face was much like that of a man, only it was a dark blue-grey colour, with deep-set dark brown eyes, a furrowed, extensively wrinkled forehead, and a very flat, wide nose, along with thin but very long lips. I also discerned it had long, lean, muscular legs, with scant hair over the knees, and of course under the armpits, and the arms were also long and lean, and fell to well beyond the knees. I would say without question that this creature was easily over 8 foot tall, and possibly 700 pounds or more, and even though he was so slim and lanky, I discerned he was exceedingly heavy, based on how majestic, sturdy and robust he was. It would rather be like comparing a heavy-built army tank to a flimsy modern-day vehicle of about the same size. The army tank, being so much stronger and more powerful, would be infinitely heavier and pack a much bigger punch. That is how solid and dense his anatomy appeared, which in my personal opinion is equally on par with a super soldier a giant or very large impressive creature like a rhino, ox or lion. I believe the only reason I was seeing this elusive, mysterious creature was because he was exceedingly curious about this strange cloud that had been surreptitiously dumped on my land by peoples unknown, for reasons I could not begin to comprehend. To my astonishment, he lifted up one of the sizable clouds in his hands as if it was a ball, almost as if it weighed nothing, and looked up at it, and that was when I realized what it was, because I was looking through my binoculars. Oh my goodness, poor thing, I thought. It was a sheep that had become so enormous from years of not being sheared that it could barely walk, as it was a bundle and complete mass of wool that resembled a cloud. I watched the strange humanoid critter that all these years later I now know was a Bigfoot. He scratched his head as if to say, "Ha! I know what you are now. But why do you have so much wool on your body?" I could sense that the critter was almost as troubled as I was that this poor sheep was so completely incapacitated by wool. Indeed, all 3 sheep were exactly the same. Without thinking twice, I darted to the phone to call Benjamin, the man who shared my sheep for me, and I told him about the enigmatic, incongruous quandary I faced, and bless his heart, he told me he'd be over in a minute. I felt a huge, monumental sense of relief, because it was heinously cruel to have a sheep in such shoddy condition, who hadn't been sheared for goodness knows how many years. I looked out of the window and the Bigfoot had gone, and in that second I felt disappointed, for I had wanted to study the critter still further. Before long I was greeting the sheep shearer and leading him over the field. "My God, I've never seen anything like this before. These poor sheep can barely walk. Where on earth did you get them from?" "Well, I don't really know. Some very strange men arrived with an animal trailer and just dumped them on my land. I have no idea where they're from." "They must know you have sheep of your own," suggested the shearer, "and intentionally dumped them on you. But where they come from is anyone's guess, and why anyone would let them get into this kind of state, God only knows. Even so, I don't want to judge anyone. Maybe they were found in the wild or something. Boy, I would like to know their story. But we need to remove these fleeces, but this is going to be far from easy, because the fleece will pull on the skin and cut the animal, so it's not as straightforward as a normal shear." "Do you think you can do it?" "You bet," he said. "I've entered all kinds of sheep shearing competitions in Australia and around the world, so if anyone can do it, it's me. I'm actually quite excited about the challenge, I'm not afraid to admit." I can assure you this was not an easy job by any manner of means for this very kind, generous man to remove all the wool from my sheep, but he did it at no expense to me, out of the goodness of his heart, and a procedure that would normally take 2 minutes took over 45 minutes per sheep, and the wool on the sheep was humongous, tipping the scales at 87 pounds on number 1, and on sheep number 2, 80 pounds, and on sheep number 3, 89.5 pounds. Luckily the sheep were exceedingly cooperative, with a little sedation of course, and handled the whole ordeal exceedingly well, with just a few little nicks on their skin that were finally sterilised. I could see that the sheep could not believe what it was like to have that heavy burden and weight lifted off them that they'd been carrying for so long, and the vet confirmed that they were all in exceedingly good health, which in itself was a miracle. It was ironic how small and slender the sheep were under all that hair. They needed to be fattened up, that was for sure. Of course, when my husband and daughter returned from the fete, followed by a pizza evening spent with friends, they couldn't wait to tell me about their grand and fabulous day at the fete. "I'm sorry, Mum," said my daughter, "but you really missed out. The fete was absolutely amazing, and the cooking demonstration was brilliant. The burgers that chef made were the best I've ever tasted. They were moist and succulent with a touch of spice. Just perfect." "You're going to have to tell me the secret ingredients," I said, with a twinkle in my eye. "How did the fudge go down?" "It sold like hotcakes, Mum. Your fudge is the best. Everybody's asking for the recipe." "Well, that's good," I said. "How about your day, sweetheart?" said my husband. "It must have been very lonely for you on your own, but I do know how you get stuck into your work." "On the contrary," I said, "I would say staying at home, I succeeded admirably in overshadowing your day in leaps and bounds, because it turned out that my day was more exciting than yours, and that is not an understatement." My husband looked astonished. "Now you've got me. What happened?" After I told my family what had transpired, they were agog, and promptly ran to the field to see our 3 new additions to the family, for I was determined, come what may, that we would take care of these sheep for the rest of their natural lives. As for the humanoid dark hairy critter, no one could tell me what I'd seen, but I'm so glad to inform you that they didn't doubt my word for it. True to her word, Shane Farrell arrived at my home on the Tuesday afternoon to collect her art exhibit that I'd worked day and night to finish, but the commission had been seamless, and the work, even if I say so myself, was outstanding. I knew that Shane would be as delighted with the piece as indeed I was, as I believe it was one of my most momentous works of art to date, as it was as if the Black Panther had come to life and walked out of the picture into our reality. It was that good. "Come with me," I said, guiding her to the gallery, where the artwork was on the easel, covered by a sheet. The woman began trembling. "Don't mind me," she said. "I get like this when I'm excited. I just can't wait." I pulled away the fabric, and Shane gasped in astonishment, and tears began to pour down her eyes. "It's sublime," she said. "It really looks like Shadow. It looks like he's lying on the sofa in our lounge, just like a domestic pussycat. I don't know what to say. You've excelled. I'm overwhelmed. The colours you've used, they're so vibrant. And the black of her coat, it's rich, it's luxurious. I don't know what to say. I'm overwhelmed." "That's because with the black there are many layers and depths of colour, with varying tones, which enhances the realism. You never use one straight colour. Every colour has lots of tones underneath it." "And what about her eyes? It's as if she's staring right back at me through the picture." "I know. I'm very pleased with them," I confessed proudly. I was to find out later that her husband broke down in tears of joy when he received the painting, describing it as the best gift that he had ever received in his life. I was to learn that even visitors to their home had stopped dead in their tracks and said, "Oh my God! For a moment I thought it was real. I thought you had a live panther on your settee." As an artist, that is what you want to hear. As for the Bigfoot critter, whilst painting in my studio, there were 2 occasions when I had the distinct impression that I was being watched, or even studied if you like, and I looked up to see a black humanoid face staring at me through the window, and then it disappeared. If I had not seen the creature before, I truly think I would second-guess myself, and very much doubt that that is what I'd seen. But I am in no doubt, because I have seen that elusive creature before, and I know he resides on our land, and I think it might be just a wee bit curious about my art. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Melissa Granger, and my story that ultimately led to my Bigfoot encounter happened when I was staying on my uncle's farm in the Kentucky countryside in 1985. Of course, I didn't want to be there. I wanted to be anywhere else in the entire world, rather than stuck in a boring colonial mansion that was so old it probably harboured the unseen energies or spiritual imprints of previous residents that had long since passed away. And what if these ghostly, uninvited and unwelcome house guests were still loitering around, not even realising that they were dead? For I had heard horrifying stories indeed like that, about houses that are steeped in a rich, vibrant history, much like my uncle's home. If that thought were not bone-chilling enough for someone like myself, who had only ever slept in modern homes all my life, who in their right mind wanted to be stuck in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by acres of rolling countryside, ubiquitous trees, mountains and lakes. In theory, I know that sounds incredibly picturesque and pretty, and indeed I'm sure it is. But what about the vibrant lure of the bright lights, the buzz, the chaos, the disturbing pandemonium of New York City, with its nighttime bars, restaurants, honking taxicabs, wild parties and feisty street brawls? For it is here where I lived on surges of adrenaline and felt alive, intoxicated and mesmerised, dancing the night away to hip 80s music, while gyrating my hips and swinging and oscillating my arms with the nimble dexterity of an octopus. Then, of course, drinking far too much lemonade, secretly laced with vodka, which was a prerequisite for an evening out, which ultimately meant one invariably ended up throwing up in a taxicab. And the driver, in disgust and revulsion, threw us out of his taxi, shouting blue murder, and swearing blind that he would never pick up a bunch of obnoxious, unruly, and loud, belligerent teenagers ever again. Yes, you've guessed right. I was a boshy, stroppy teenager that simply despised my parents and belligerently disregarded any of the house rules. I was spoilt, self-centred, selfish and unrestrained, especially when it came to my sharp, ungenerous tongue. I was not afraid to be rude and opinionated, and both my parents were pulling out their hair in exasperation, for they did not know how to handle me. I was one of those tumultuous, angry teenagers that did as I please and stuff anybody else. I smoked, drank and experimented with the hallucinogenic effects of magic mushrooms and got into all kinds of trouble with willful, immature acts, rather like throwing wet tissue paper around the classroom, which I always thought was hilariously funny, or putting some roaches in the teacher's desk. My regular school reports brought my parents little solace or comfort. They would say, "Melissa is a problematic teenager that stirs up trouble, is rude, undisciplined, badly behaved during class. Her performance in school is poor, and she doesn't pay any attention, which is a pity because she's a bright young woman with the potential to succeed, if she learnt to focus." My parents had tried absolutely everything to discipline me, but the tougher their rules, the more out of control I became. I would liken myself to being like an enraged bull that would see red if my parents rained down any kind of ordered structure and control over my life. I would constantly tell them how much I hated and despised them, and that they were the worst parents in the entire world, which was brutally unkind, but then I wasn't a nice person. My mother would sometimes tell me, "Melissa, I really love you, but I don't like you at the moment. Your behaviour is so appalling. Why, oh why are you so angry all the time? What irks you so much?" It was on visiting the headmistress at my school that the head told my mother, "Your daughter needs to get off her lazy backside and do some hard work, to knock some common sense into that head of hers. In my experience, when a teenager has to do some hard physical labour, it begins to change them from the inside out. You need to try and send her to a working farm, where she has to work very hard." That was when it was decided that I would go and stay at my uncle's farm, with my two cousins, Percy, who was 14, and Bea, who was 16, like I was. I couldn't stand my uncle's family. They were nauseatingly, sickly sweet, mawkish, polite, and well-behaved, always conducting themselves appropriately. Not the sort of people who ever let their hair down or knew how to party. In fact, they were clueless about the real world, naively tucked away in their charming little whimsical farmhouse, with only the birds and the bees and a bunch of farm animals for company. It didn't get more pathetic than that. Well, so I thought at the time. Of course, the revelation that I was going to stay at my uncle's farm went down with as much appeal as a lead balloon, and I kicked up a huge stink about it and screamed at my parents like a wild, unrestrained animal. And you could see by the wary, fatigued looks on their faces that they couldn't wait to see the back of me. And who could blame them, really? When the taxi-cab finally dropped me off at my cousin's farmhouse, it was late in the evening, and so I was welcomed by the entire family with gushing warm hugs and big saccharine smiles, and then promptly whisked away to my bedroom, as I was informed by my Aunt Kate that it would be an early morning start for me. And she wasn't wrong about that. "Get up, Melissa! Get up! Come on, wakey wake, rise and shine," said my cousin Bea, shaking me wide awake. The first morning of the holidays. Your job this morning is to feed the chickens before breakfast and then to muck out one of the horse stables. Are you kidding? I said, putting the pillow over my head. I'm sleeping and I have no intention of waking up until lunchtime. Can you not see I'm tired? I moaned. Are you for real? Said Bee. You really are lazy. I'll have to call my mother to sort you out. She knows how to work wonders on the living dead. All of a sudden I was woken to a jug of ice-cold water being poured all over my face, and then both my cousins began to laugh at me. I began to rant and rave and wave my clenched fists at them and call my cousins, aunt and uncle all the most demeaning names that you could ever imagine that are not worth repeating, and they were not at all reactive like my parents would have been. Instead, they just smiled warmly at me and asked me politely to do my chores. Melissa, it'll be really great if you just feed the chickens. Over the next few days, I continued to behave like a petulant, spoilt brat. But my aunt's family remained completely unfazed by all my melodramatic shenanigans that were so dramatic and over the top, I would have made an elephant in musk look tame. Once I'd completed my chores, they would praise me for my work, and I was beginning to appreciate the invigorating benefits of the brisk fresh air, exercise, and even the work, because it became therapeutic for me, and I was secretly loving my time interacting with the animals, but I seemed to have rarely connected with a heavily pregnant black horse called Another Chance, who was in her last trimester and was very close to her due date. I don't know what it was about this thoroughbred horse, but the moment I met her, I felt this connection with her. And it was peculiarly strange, but I had finally met an animal that just seemed to get me. I had noticed the horse watching me when I'd had an altercation with Bee, and I had shouted at her and tossed some horse manure in her face. Another Chance had promptly trotted over to me and whinnied, and proceeded to follow me around the yard like a dog. The other horses eyed me warily, seemingly perturbed as to why Another Chance would remotely be interested in befriending this hot-headed teenager who was constantly having tempestuous outbursts. I had never believed that living in the country could be so rewarding and so good. But as time progressed, I was forgetting to have my usual temper tantrums and rude eruptions, and I was getting up early just to be able to go and visit Another Chance. I so enjoyed brushing her, washing her, cleaning out her stable, and feeding her all the extra calories that she needed to support the little life that was growing within her. I couldn't ride her, of course, which really was unfortunate, but I had developed a bond with her that was nothing short of extraordinary. I can't believe how much Another Chance loves you, said Bee. I've never seen her behave like this with anyone before. She follows you around like a devoted dog. I think it may be because she sees herself in you a little. What do you mean? I asked curiously. Well, when we first brought Another Chance to our home, she was wild and temperamental. My father had never encountered such a difficult, spirited and angry horse that seemed impossible to tame. She was a lot like you when she arrived, always angry, obnoxious, and never ever in a good mood. She would swish her tail angrily, pinning back her ears and stamp her feet belligerently, and even bare her teeth at us. It was weird because she didn't have an abusive history behind her, so she had no excuse to be so pugnacious and truculent, and her previous owners had pretty much given up on her because they couldn't control her. But when she came here, we put up with her horse-like tantrums and nonsense, and somehow persevered, and it paid off because she eventually calmed down, and is now docile and very happy these days, and is one horse least likely to give us any trouble. Is that what you've been doing with me? I asked, putting up with me and persevering. Pretty much, laughed Bee. You've got to admit it. When you first arrived here, you were incredibly temperamental, hot-headed and as rude as hell, and Dad said you were exactly like Another Chance, and we needed to persevere with you like we had with her. And look, it's paid off. You're actually nice. Why do you think we called this horse Another Chance? Because we believed that there was good in her. You think I'm a nicer person? I asked, looking surprised. Think so? I know so, said Bee. I'm not going to kid. When I knew you were coming to stay with us, I was exceedingly upset, because I never liked you. You were always such a nasty piece of work, who was always having tantrums about the most ridiculous infantile things. Why, only last night, the family were talking about your transformation while you've been staying here on the farm, and everybody was saying what an incredible person you actually are. And I think that Another Chance saw the good in you, that we actually failed to see at first. That's why I like her, I said fondly, feeding Another Chance a large chunk of my apple, which she took out of my hands with her mouth. She got me from day one. I think she did too, said Bee, giving me a big, warm, affectionate hug. It was true. I had changed significantly, and why I do not know, but I certainly felt different. Maybe it had something to do with this loving family's acceptance of me. Despite my very best efforts to create chaos and discord, and to ruffle feathers, they had not fought back. When I'd had a hissy fit, they had treated me with kindness, and all my anger and rage had dissipated, and these days it seemed that I was always upbeat, happy, and very positive. One day my uncle proudly told me that it wouldn't be long before Another Chance would be giving birth to a foal, as mammary secretion tests from the vets affirmed by the level of electrolytes that Another Chance was about to drop any minute. I had noticed that her waxy teats were dripping colostrum, and she was becoming nervous and uneasy, while her tail was twitching restlessly. And then, to our amazement, later the following evening, at about 9:30 p.m, finally her waters burst. Everybody was so excited, as this was Last Chance's first pregnancy, and we could see that it wouldn't be long before her little foal would be born. I was determined to stay by her side, because she had become my friend, and she was so comforted and reassured by my presence that I couldn't leave her. Before long, her cervix dilated and her uterus contracted, and we waited with bated breath for the delivery to progress. But nothing happened for a long time, and my uncle realised we needed to call out the vet, because something was clearly terribly wrong. And I could feel the heightened level of anxiety in the air, as everyone ran around in a frantic state. After the vet arrived, the delivery progressed, and the dark foal slipped out with ease, followed by the afterbirth. But we realised that the beautiful foal was dead. No one said a word, and with tears in our eyes, we watched Another Chance lick her foal and even press her hooves against it to try and awaken it. The foal remained lifeless. It was so heartbreaking, and I could sense her obvious distress. The vet told us to leave the dead foal with her for a while longer before we buried it with the afterbirth, so that Another Chance could come to terms with her foal's death. "It's very sad," he said. "Only yesterday I was at your neighbour's farm, and their horse died during her delivery. But the foal is absolutely fine. And now this happens tonight. This has not been a good week for me for foaling, but this is the downside of my job." "And a huge downside of owning animals," said my uncle. "Poor Another Chance. Do you think she's going to be all right?" he asked. "Well, you can never be sure," said the vet. "Horses are as individual and unique as human beings. But things are not looking good," he said. "In truth, Another Chance looks rather distressed. I fear she may slip into a depression. I have known her for a while, and she was more emotional than any of your other horses, and that is my big worry and concern when it comes to her." "You're not wrong about that," said my uncle, "but these days she is a very calm horse." "Well, we can only hope she stays that way," said the vet. While everybody returned to the house, I insisted on staying with Another Chance, and my uncle told me he'd be back in half an hour to remove the dead foal and the afterbirth. "Are you sure you want to stay here, Melissa?" he said. "It's very dark out here, and it's getting late." "Absolutely," I insisted. "I don't want to leave Last Chance on her own. She's so sad and broken. I can't do that to her." It was getting cool in the stables, so my cousin Bee brought me a blanket while I sat in the stable with Last Chance. I tried to talk to her reassuringly and soothingly, and she continued to lick the foal in a desperate attempt to revive the poor little thing. She wasn't accepting its death very easily. Before long I was slipping into a sleep, and then I heard the stable door open very slowly and quietly, as if an intruder was trying to be very discreet. I thought with relief that it was my uncle coming back. What had taken him so long, I wondered? He was supposed to be burying the little foal. and I was about to say something when I saw the 7-foot dark shadowy humanoid form move stealthily towards another chance and begin to stroke the horse very gently with these massive hands while chattering away to her in a strange soothing tongue which sounded like a foreign language. Another chance was so delighted to see the dark stranger and comforted by his presence that I actually began to feel waves of jealousy. Who was this impostor, I wondered with irritation, and why did he have such an amazing bond with my favourite horse? In truth, he looked like a massive bodybuilder dressed in a very believable, authentic-looking gorilla suit. But this was no suit that he was wearing, for the long flowing dark human-like hair was firmly attached to the body, and there were scanter areas of hair on the upper torso which enabled me to see the taut definition of very powerful refined stomach muscles. The creature was exceedingly powerful and strong, with overlong arms and very sizable feet. I watched as the critter squatted down on his powerful legs and examined the dead foal, and then he lifted it in his arms, threw it over his excessively large shoulders, along with the afterbirth, and was about to glide out of the stables when he stopped short as he saw me, dead in his tracks. He eyed me with an incredulous look of astonishment upon his face, and he looked at me through deep-set dark eyes that displayed deep concern. The light of the stables had been left on, so I could see the creature very clearly, and far from looking like an ape, I later concluded that he looked like a giant man that was covered in hair, as his face was exceedingly human, and his neck so short that you could barely see it. The wild man, which is how I would describe him, locked eyes with me for a long moment, holding my gaze, and then he promptly glided away. I was so astonished and confounded, I didn't know what to think, for I had never seen a human being like that before. But whoever he was, it was clear that he had befriended another chance, and anyone who was a friend of hers was a friend of mine. It seemed that he had an exceptionally special relationship with this magnificent thoroughbred. Even the other horses in the stable block had not reacted adversely to this strange being, as they were very settled in their stables and not distressed in any way, giving me the distinct impression that this elusive wild man was a common visitor on the property, of whom the horses were well acquainted with. I think I wasn't afraid of the strange humanoid because of the kindness and compassion that he had exhibited towards another chance, and I was too nonplussed by what I'd seen that I needed to process everything before I began to tell my relatives about my strange encounter. A little while later, something so extraordinary and profound happened that was incredibly miraculous, so much so that it transformed my view of life forever. All of a sudden, with what seemed like a wave of a spell-working wand, I saw a tiny foal appear before my eyes, as if by magic. It looked identical to the one that had died, with the exception of a little white marking on its forehead. I was astonished, so much so that my mouth dropped open to the ground, and my eyes grew as wide as saucers. This glorious, perfect, and adorable foal was being thrust forward into the stable with a very gentle push by the wild man, and it looked like the foal was covered in afterbirth, which I soon realised was possibly from the original dead foal's afterbirth, so that Last Chance would believe the youngling was her own. What a clever stunt! The wild man glanced at me with a jubilant, elated expression on his face and a naughty twinkle in his sparkling, deep-set eyes, and I sensed he was saying, "This is our little secret." And then he pointed towards the youngling, and the most extraordinary thing happened, of which the memory today still brings a joyous expression upon my face, for it was indeed a miraculous moment of note. Another Chance trotted towards the little foal and smelt it. She then began to lick it all over, and the little foal began to nurse her teats so naturally. I could see a proud expression in Last Chance's eyes, as if she was saying, "I knew my foal wasn't dead," and she became besotted and devoted to her youngling in what seemed like a second. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere born from a mother's grievous despair and depression lifted in seconds, and the rapturous joy in the stable was immense. The wild man stood there, watching mother and foal interact with each other, when suddenly he glided away, as we could hear the footsteps of my uncle venturing towards the stables, and I think that frightened the wild man off. "Sorry I didn't come sooner, Melissa," I heard my uncle's voice calling me. "I fell asleep. How is another chance doing?" As he entered the stable and saw the nursing foal, he was so stunned, and his eyes grew wide, and his mouth opened in astonishment, and for a second he didn't know what to say. "What the heck has happened here?" he said. "The foal was dead, but now it's alive. That's not possible." I was going to tell my uncle about what happened, but I thought better of it and decided to say nothing. "Tell me, what happened?" piped my uncle, studying the foal curiously. "You must have seen something." "I don't know," I said. "I didn't see anything. I fell asleep," I lied. But, stammered my uncle, "this is not the foal that died. It didn't have a white marking on its forehead." "Are you sure you aren't mistaken?" I asked. "I'm almost certain it did." Now my uncle looked very confused and promptly went inside to call the vet, returning to the stable looking completely befuddled. "Something weird is going on here," he told me. "I've just spoken to the vet, and she assures me that it isn't possible for a dead foal to come back to life. She also assures me that the foal that was born tonight most certainly did not have a white marking on its forehead, and that another chance was not expecting twins, so I've covered everything. However, she did happen to mention that the neighbour's foal born last night had a white marking on its forehead." "You think that this foal belongs to your neighbour?" I asked. "Not necessarily. We first have to establish whether the neighbour's foal is actually missing," said my uncle. "I do hope it's not her foal, because another chance is completely smitten over her youngling, and she's being very protective over it. I couldn't bear for it to be taken away from her. She's deliriously happy. Look at her. It would break my heart again if she had to lose her foal all over again." "Well, maybe your neighbour will let them stay together," I suggested. "Emma Codger? Are you kidding? If this is her foal, she'll be here first thing in the morning to collect it, although how it got here, God only knows. I can assure you, she is not the most likeable character, and is as hard as nails. She'll probably accuse me of stealing the foal from her. I wouldn't put anything past her." "Oh dear," I said, feeling my heart sink, because in my gut I knew this must be the foal that the wild man had taken. "Did you see what happened to the afterbirth?" asked my uncle. "And if this is not her real foal, what happened to the original one? This case gets curiouser and curiouser by the minute." "Sorry," I said. "I can't help you, Uncle." The following morning, I'm afraid, the news wasn't good at all, and I was completely devastated. It would seem that Emma Codger had experienced a robbery the previous night at her farm, and the door of her stable block had been broken down with a brute force, and it appeared that her foal was missing. On hearing our strange story, she informed us she'd be over to our premises forthwith with her horse-trailer to pick up the foal. As the surly woman climbed out of her vehicle, my uncle led her to the stable block, and I followed, my heart compounded by a heavy sadness, because I knew in my gut that Miss Emma Codger was going to take another chance's foal, and the idea of that happening was nonsensical to me. "What size feet do you have?" she asked my uncle, glancing down at his shoes very suspiciously. "I'm about a 7, said my uncle. "Not very big. Why do you ask?" "Well, the person who broke into my stables last night left a foot impression in the mud, and it was enormous, much bigger than your foot is." "What impertinence! Are you suggesting I took your foal, Mrs. Codger?" said my uncle, looking bereft. "I would hardly call you about the strange manner of events that have occurred in my farm of late, if that were indeed the case." Mrs. Codger stared again at my uncle's feet, and then piped. "Do you ever potter around the place without shoes on?" she asked. "Of course not," said my father, looking frustrated. "What an extraordinary question to ask me." "Come with me," he said, beckoning the frustrating woman into the stables. "This is mother and foal," said my father. "Marvellous-looking horse," said Mrs. Codger. "What a specimen! Make sure you give her some exercise to help eliminate the extra fluids in her stomach. It does look rather distended." "Look how happy mother and foal are," I piped. "They do look incredibly happy," admitted Mrs. Codger, watching how protective Another Chance was being towards her foal. "Why did you drag me out like this?" piped Mrs. Codger. "That is not my foal." "Are you sure?" said my uncle, looking perplexed. "Very sure," said Emma Codger, walking away from the stable block, looking a little irritated. You cannot begin to imagine how thrilled we were that Another Chance could keep her beloved foal. Looking back all these years later, I do wonder if Mrs. Emma Codger, on seeing how happy Another Chance was with her foal, secretly decided to let mother and foal stay together. Maybe there was a heart in her after all. Why I never told my relatives about the Bigfoot I encountered is an enigma even today. But it might be because I wanted to protect both the horse and the Bigfoot, and that's probably the reason. It's funny how quickly people begin to doubt themselves and their memories, as after a while my aunt and uncle, and even my own cousins, really began to believe that maybe that foal did have a white spot on its forehead after all, and had not really been dead. For to them that was the only plausible explanation for this abnormal case. I was to learn that even the vet, when later asked about the case, could no longer remember whether the foal had a white marking on its forehead or not, and thought it likely that it probably did. I never understood why my relatives didn't have blood tests done on mother and foal to establish the truth to this conundrum, but maybe they wanted to believe in miracles. But whatever way you look at it, it was a miracle. For that night, I will never ever forget. I would go so far as to say that those summer holidays that I spent at my cousin's were indeed miraculous and life-changing. For when I returned home, even my parents barely recognised me, and asked me what had happened to the angry kid inside me. I never retreated back to my old ways, and ended up getting great grades at school. All these years later, I'm very happily married, with 2 children who have long since left the nest, and living in the Kentucky countryside with a beloved horse of my own, from the bloodline of the little foal that was replaced in the stable on that fateful night that will never ever be forgotten. And this horse is to date one of the best horses I have ever owned, and I've called her Chosen Chance because she was chosen. But in truth, Another Chance has my heart forever, and is sorely missed. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Meryl Fletcher, and I'm from Toronto, where I live in an attractive high-rise apartment block in downtown Core, south of Bloor Street. And my extraordinary story that ultimately led to my phenomenal idiosyncratic Bigfoot encounter happened in October of 2003, when I was 23 years old, and only a few months away from being married to my fiancé Carl. Growing up, I had 4 very close-knit friends, Sally, Rebecca, Madison and Louise, and we had interacted with each other when we were still in diapers and attended the same schools together, and had grown incredibly close over the years, and considered each other to be more like family than friends. I had decided I wanted to do something sur genre, or extra special if you like, with my friends for my hen party, and so I booked a pretty little cabin in a remote part of Roberta's panoramic and resplendent Rocky Mountains, as this idea had always been something that I'd wanted to do. I've always adored nature, crackling fires, and romantic log cabins. Of course, when I did tell my friends about where we would be spending my hen party, I could detect an enthusiastic rise followed by a very sizable fall in their voices, which they had tried to mask, but I was not easily fooled. I could tell they were bitterly disappointed. I think they thought I was going to whisk them off to Las Vegas, where we would be spending our evenings walking down the glamorous strip, the central artery of Sin City, if you like, where you find all the gambling joints, restaurant bars and shopping malls, and could enjoy the fountain display at the Bellagio. I'm sure they secretly hoped I would book a suite for 3 nights at the exclusive Waldorf Astoria for lots of daily pampering, and that we would enjoy our nights spent drinking up a storm, dancing the night away and even gambling, or of course watching the paranormal mind-reading magic show at balls in Las Vegas. "Why a cabin?" asked Madison, sounding so flat and downhearted over the telephone, as if I'd told her that someone had just died. "I thought you were planning to do something, well, you know, more festive and extraordinaire, shall we say." "I know it sounds lame," I said, "but I truly think a cabin in Alberta, surrounded by exquisite countryside, will be remarkably special. It's something I've always wanted to do, and never ever got round to it. There's no time like the present, especially with the 4 of my very best friends." "But why a cabin in Alberta?" came Madison's perturbed voice. "Because," I said, "it'll be fun. We could go for hikes in the countryside, exploring the woods, and enjoying barbecues in the middle of nowhere." Madison let out a huge groan. As if the idea of my hen party was about as desirable as a piece of dog turd that she'd discovered on her patio floor. "I never thought I'd say this, Merrill, but your idea is simply weird. I'm not going to pretend it appeals to me at all, because it most certainly doesn't. I personally would much prefer to be pampered within an inch of my life at the Bellagio than doing anything that involves hard work. Getting sweaty, dirty and exhausted from trekking laboriously uphill in my walking boots. I hardly fancy that. I would so much prefer to get sweaty on the dance floor and get tipsy drinking lots of stunning sparkling champagne, rather than walking up some arduous mountain slopes. "Well, it's my hen party," I said, "so I'm calling the shots. You'll have your turn next, and if you want to fly us to the moon, well, then it'll be your call." And so there we were, all 5 of us, driving down this pretty rugged, precipitous country road in Alberta, quite literally in the middle of nowhere. It was during the fall, with moderately warm, dry daytime temperatures and very chilly evenings. The scenery was utterly spectacular, and I noticed that my less than enamoured friends were considerably more upbeat and sanguine. The long, windy roads were surrounded by mountainous elevations, clustered with the exquisite deep reds and yellows of the sub-supine larch and aspen trees, mixed in with the rich evergreen foliage of the coniferous trees, along with the backdrop of glaciers and mountains, which was exquisitely beautiful. "You have to admit it, girls, whatever you may have said about Merrill's idea for a hen party," said Sally. "This place is drop-dead gorgeous, and the scenery just blows my mind. It's spectacular." Everyone heartily agreed that the scenery was indeed out of this world, and I could feel the energy in the car lift, much like a pendulum swinging in the opposite direction, as if my friends had suddenly become much more animated and enthusiastic about our little weekend escape, and were all chattering away excitedly to themselves. Before long, our Land Rover Discovery was winding down another rocky road, where the pebbles were beating viciously under the belly of the vehicle, despite it being a 4-wheel drive, causing those unpleasant precarious wobbles and jilts you invariably experience on uneven terrain, and of course on a rugged road like this. Finally we found our way to the enchanting little cabin that really was stuck in the middle of nowhere, in a pretty small clearing, surrounded by opulent-looking forest that was ablaze with trees wearing their leafy, resplendent, rich garments of vintage golds and reds that you would only ever expect to find in a king's palace, for that was how magnificent it was. The right-hand side of the cabin stretched out into a wide, open, flowery prairie where a couple of horses were grazing. The utopian, wholesome-looking cabin was very old and rustic, and at one time had been a miner's cabin that had been built in the early 1800s, but maintenance over the years had brought it up to speed, and it had some modern additions to it, like a generous-sized wooden wraparound deck and larger windows. The inside of the well-appointed cabin boasted 3 small, sumptuously decorated bedrooms, a single standard bathroom, a tiny but very efficient modern kitchen, and a sizable living area that opened out into a magnificent porch. Pride of place in the living area was the largest, most incredible fireplace that I've ever seen, and I can't even use the words to describe how magnificent it was. No attention to detail had been spared, as the place had been luxuriously decorated with only comfort in mind, with cosy couches covered with colourful plumped-up cushions, and large walnut bookshelves with shelves bursting with interesting books, some that looked very old. while on the walls there was a vast selection of blown-up mining photographs of people in the 1800s, and I tell you it enhanced the historic charm and appeal of the sumptuous and tranquil idyllic abode, almost as if you were stepping back in time. It did not take us long to unpack and to get the fire crackling away happily in the grate, as there was a stack of firewood prepared for us around the back of the cabin for easy accessibility and convenience. It had been a warm, dry day, but there was now a very distinctive chill in the air, and so a fire was a prerequisite for this cosy night, and we were all looking forward to roasting marshmallows over the open flames later on, and drinking warm cups of hot chocolate before finally retiring to the cosiest beds you've ever seen, fitted with luxury linens. All of a sudden there was an ominous knock at the cabin door, and I opened it to see a hillbilly standing there, who was tall and lean, and probably in his early 40s, with a receding hairline and a faint glimmer of a moustache above his lips. He was smiling at me with a toothless grin, and a very stupid look on his face, and wearing dishevelled, unkempt clothes that looked as if he'd been sleeping in them, and he didn't smell great either. A mixture of whisky and sweat comes to mind, that I discerned on his breath. "Hello, can I help you?" I asked the shabby, disagreeable-looking man, feeling a nasty chill going down my spine, as he was leering at me inappropriately, and surveying me much like a vulture that scans its prey with a ravenous, dark pair of eyes. "I'm the caretaker," he said. "Just checking to see if you've settled in all right." "We've settled in fine, thank you very much," I said, trying to close the door on him fast, but the awful cretin promptly blocked it with his large boot. But by this time my friends had gathered around me to see what on earth was going on. "Yes," I said, glancing down at the man's muddy boot. "Anything else?" "Yeah, I wanted to say, I hope you have a good time," said the man, showing me a mouthful of gums with a couple of wobbly yellow teeth still stuck in their hollows that looked suspiciously loose. "Thank you," I said immediately, closing the door behind me. "What a creep," piped Louise. "That dimwit gave me the chills. Did you see the way he looked at us? We must make sure to keep the doors locked at night. I don't feel comfortable with him loitering around. There's something really off about him, like he's not completely compos mentos, if you know what I mean." "He says he's the caretaker," I said. "For this place," said Louise, shaking her head doubtfully. "Something's not right there." I'm glad to say that for the first couple of days and nights spent at our cabin, they flowed seamlessly, without a single hitch, with the exception, of course, of that sinister, ambiguous moron that would make an appearance from time to time at our door, with the pathetic, futile excuse that he was checking in on us. He would put us on edge, especially when he grinned at us, as his smile was disturbingly menacing. It didn't help that he didn't have any teeth. I noticed that he always looked at us with these very unsettling, rather bone-chilling predatory eyes, almost as if we were his prey, and he was sizing us up. Another part of me firmly disliked the extreme interest he appeared to be showing us that really did ruffle my feathers. There was a part of me that sensed he was not right in the head, almost as if he was a simpleton or ignoramus with the intelligence of a gnat, if you like. Apart from that, everything had been fabulous for the five of us, and we were having a remarkable, wonderful time, as we'd enjoyed hiking adventures, a spot of fishing by the lake, and delicious barbecues over the fire pit with the most tender, succulent, juicy meat, as I'd gone out of a limb to stock our fridge with the finest cheeses, vegetables and quality foods that you can buy. We had relished the special moments drinking glasses of delicious white wine by a crackling fire, reliving nostalgic memories from our childhoods, and I would go so far as to say that my friends were seriously beginning to believe that this holiday in the cabin was not half so bad after all. "You know what?" said Sally, curling her legs up comfortably on the sofa and taking a sip of hot chocolate from her mug, on the last and final night of our holiday. We were all sitting by a crackling fire, and it was beginning to get late. "I've really been enjoying myself, girls. I'm not going to kid. I truly fancied a hen party in Vegas, but in a strange, rather peculiar way, I think that this adventure, here in the cabin, has certainly trumped Vegas for me." "In what way?" I asked, feeling secretly very pumped up by this revelation. "I don't know," said Sally reflectively. It's just we've not had such good open chats for a long time together like this. We've been able to relax and let our hair down and talk and talk and talk, and it's been great. Please don't keep talking as if our holidays are already over, said Madison. I'm enjoying myself here. I don't want to be reminded of Toronto while I'm unwinding. Thank you very much. All of a sudden we heard a rap at the door, and we groaned because we knew who it was. Oh no, it's that moron again. Yes, I said, opening the door, closing it tightly to my body so that the hillbilly only got to see my head poking out. Just checking to see whether you've enjoyed your stay here. Yes, thank you very much, I said. So you'll be leaving in the afternoon tomorrow, he said, giving me a chilling toothless grin that gave me the creeps. That's right, I said, slamming the door shut and returning to the settee around the open fire. What a creep, I said, taking a large sip of white wine. Look at me, I said, lifting up my sleeves of my PJs. I've broken out in goosebumps all over my body. I don't know why, but it happens every time when I open the door to that obnoxious half-wit. It's something about him. It sets my nerves on edge. It's the way he looks at you through those vulture-like eyes, almost like he wants to devour your flesh. I know it sounds silly, but he really, really does freak me out. Oh, don't talk like that, piped Madison, her eyes growing anxious. You'll give me nightmares tonight. I won't be able to get to sleep. That night, when we returned to bed, we were awoken to a loud, terrifying rapping on our door. Madison came running into the bedroom, clutching her gown over her body in anguish. She looked terrified and very discomposed. It's the caretaker, she whispered. I wasn't able to sleep tonight, and I heard his footsteps. He's carrying an axe in his hand, and I'm not joking either. What are we going to do? Well, maybe he's cutting firewood, suggested Sally. What? In the middle of the night, I said. Are you kidding, Sally? Are you being for real? No, something's not right about this, I said. No one comes to the door at 2 o'clock in the morning with an axe in their hand. They clearly have a nefarious agenda in mind. I told you, that man is super weird. The rapping continued. And it was beginning to freak us out. And to make matters worse, we didn't have a telephone. All of a sudden we could hear the moron's voice shouting, Let me in! Let me in! What do you want? I said, speaking from the inside of the cabin. We're trying to sleep. We don't appreciate being so rudely woken up in the middle of the night. Bog off. I want you to let me in now, said the man. I need to talk to you. Not at 2 o'clock in the morning, you don't, I shouted. Good night. At that, the man promptly began bashing indignantly at the wooden rafters and slashing them with the axe, and began screaming like a banshee. Let me in! Let me in! Let me in! My friends and I stared at each other with wide, terrified eyes, and 2 of us were crying. We were so appalled by the banging sounds, and the axe was thrashing violently against the wood. It was very discomposing. He's going to kill us, cried Madison. I know he is. He can easily get in here, as he only needs to break down the shatterproof windows, and that won't be too hard. At that revelation, I became very angst. What are we going to do? I cried in terror. How can we protect ourselves from an axe? Knives, said Sally. And with that we ran to the kitchen to remove chopping knives from the drawer, which we dispersed among ourselves very quickly, trembling nervously, not very confident that our silly little weapons would be of much use against an axe. Please tell me this is a dream, said Madison, looking at me through wide, petrified eyes. Are we about to be killed by that horrible, horrible hillbilly? Who the heck is he? She trembled. You mark my words, he's no caretaker. Suppose he's an escaped convict, wanted for murdering his entire family. For goodness sake, Madison, don't scare us like that. It's bad enough that we're in this trouble. It would seem that Madison's ominous words hung in the air like an odorous, repugnant smell that we refused to acknowledge because it was too terrifying for words. All of a sudden, the floor-to-ceiling shatterproof windows of the porch were being quite literally hacked through by an axe, and it wouldn't be long before this villainous man entered the cabin. We could not run to our Land Rover because it was parked in the front of the cabin, but if we escaped through the back door and ran through the wooded area, there was a very good chance we could hide somewhere. We quickly opened the kitchen door and were hit hard by the cool, biting chill of an easterly wind, but we didn't care. That was the least of our troubles. We needed to get away, or we were almost certainly dead. Of that we were in no doubt. We ran in terror for our lives, with hearts exploding with trepidation and dread, still dressed in our pyjamas and our slippers. We suddenly realised that the hillbilly was on to us, and he was pursuing us, running with that horrifying axe in his hands. I've never known a moment when my body was so driven by such a discomposing, indescribable terror that is quite impossible to explain, but I could feel the heat of a powerful adrenaline surge course through my veins like a rocket, which seemed to increase the speed of my running. I could feel the rapid vibration of my heart thundering through my chest, and my breathing was rapid and intense. I did not even realise it, but I was screaming at the top of my lungs, and looking back, I never knew I was capable of screaming like that. If I was back in Seattle, I'm in no doubt that I would have woken up the entire neighbourhood for miles around, but here it was only foxes, coyotes and deer that were likely to hear my desperate and anguished cries. Suddenly my less than appropriate satin slippers caused me to slip, and I was tripped up by an obtrusive jagged stone, and I fell backwards onto the ground and struggled to get up quickly, and I began to scream as the man's hands were now grabbing my pyjamas. "Get off me!" I screamed. "Get off me! Leave me alone! Get off me! Go away!" I sat squatting him as if he was a fly or some kind of nasty bug. The man pushed me down on the ground, and I could hear the background screams of my petrified friends as they realised I'd been caught by this horrifying nutter, and it wasn't difficult to imagine what was about to happen next. I'd seen so many horror movies by now to know what my outcome would be. Being a spectator is one thing, like you are on the movies, but being in the eye of the storm and becoming the victim is not a job for the faint-hearted. Madison, one of my friends, ran forwards and aimed a large rock at the man to stop him from lashing out at me with his axe. "Don't you hurt my friend!" screamed Madison. "Don't you dare hurt her, or I will kill you myself! And don't think I don't mean it!" The toothless man was grinning from ear to ear, relishing in the heightened terror and drama that he was causing. He was glancing at Madison and then at me, in the throes of deciding of whether to drop me and run after Madison or not. It was in that moment that something so incomprehensible happened, and the only way I can describe it is like a very deep, weighty boom, boom, boom that caused the whole forest to shake, almost like something massively big was bolting and thundering through the woods towards us at the speed of a rocket, and that was when we saw him. In that second, the hands of time stood ominously still, because I was staring at a creature that even the most imaginative books of fiction would never ever be able to conjure up or even create. This monstrously huge creature that looked to be a man with ape-like influences stood before us, towering at least 9 foot tall and 3 foot wide across the shoulder area, and his pyramid-shaped head seamlessly flowed into his shoulders with no evidence of a neck. His body was so powerful, strong, sinewy and burly, especially around the upper chest area, and he had long arms that tapered to below the knees, and very powerful short legs. I noticed his body was covered with very black 4-inch hair that was shiny and very healthy looking, and I never detected any body odour on the creature, as all I could smell was the woody notes of pine. I noted that the face on this creature was very human, with a very wide, flat nose, a sloped, furrowed forehead, and a thin mouth. It would seem that all the screaming stopped in the woods, and I could hear the sound of the hillbilly's axe fall to the ground with an almighty thud, as I imagined the shock of seeing this outlandish creature had loosened his grip on the axe. I could see the elated expression on his face had dissipated like a fine mist and turned to terror, because it was clear that the deep-set eyes of this imposing, intimidating creature exhibited a menacing red eyeshine, and they were pinned directly on him. I could tell by the intelligent, discerning look in the creature's eyes that he knew exactly what was going on, and he wasn't happy about it, not one little bit at all. He was giving off the energy of a large protective lion defending his pride. As strange as it sounds, I just knew that this outlandish creature had come to our rescue in response to our terrified screams. So I just stared at him in awe, drinking in every ounce of him, like a picture at the Tate Art Gallery that you never ever want to forget. So I tried to memorize every last detail of this remarkable, lofty, majestic and incongruous beast. The critter curled back his lips to reveal large, white, human-like teeth, and he began to growl so ferociously it was exactly like being in the intimidating, majestic and sovereign presence of a lion. The creature grabbed the hillbilly and threw him over his shoulders, holding him down so effortlessly with one powerful hand, and that despite all the wiggles and frantic screams of the man, he could not escape the critter's powerful clutches. In fact, on the creature's sizable, powerfully built, hefty back, he looked pathetic and puny, like a silly doll of some kind. The creature turned to look directly at me, to see if I was all right, and I saw he had the most beautiful eyes that I've ever seen. And I still talk about those eyes today, for they were indeed the eyes of an angel, kind, protective, caring, and exceedingly loving. I could see this clearly as the moonlight was excellent on this occasion, so I imagine it must have been a full moon, but I cannot say that I noticed for sure. The critter then turned around and virtually glided away, carrying the odious wretch on his back like a sack of potatoes, until he was gone from our sight. I don't know what his intentions actually were with that despicable man, but I don't even care. I was out of harm's way, and so were my friends, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. My friends and I quickly tore out of the forest, still pumped with adrenaline, at a speed that we have never ever been able to since replicate, whilst in our pyjamas. We then thrust our essentials into the Rover so fast, and we drove away, bypassing the police station and everything else, because all we cared about was getting back home to Toronto, as indeed nothing else mattered as far as we were concerned. When I got back to Toronto, I did phone the Alberta police to tell them that I believe the caretaker of the cabin had tried to kill us, but we had managed to escape. But I made no mention of the outlandish creature that we had encountered. I instinctively knew mentioning such an enigmatic creature would hardly make me sound like a credible witness. The police phoned me later to say that there had been a thorough search of the cabin and the surrounding area, and there was no sign of the mystery man. And we were informed that there was no caretaker at the cabin, ever, at any stage. "You must have been terrified," said the policeman sympathetically. "You left half your stuff at the cabin. Would you like us to post it back to you?" "It's not necessary," I said. "Just give it all to charity." It was 3 weeks later when my girlfriends and I finally got together for a lunch in Toronto, and naturally the first thing we all said is, "What in God's name was that incredible creature that came to our miraculous rescue?" But none of us at that stage knew the answer to that extraordinary question. Of course, now we know it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch or Yeti, if you like. But all these years later, we still hold this king of the forest in exceedingly high regard. "I've never been so terrified in all my life," said Madison, putting her hand on mine. "I thought that horrible man was going to hack you to death." "Oh, I know he was," I said, taking a large gulp of wine to compose myself, for indeed even the mere memory was making me shake. "You know," said Sally, "I've always thought terrifying scenes like this, with demented, deranged axemen, belonged in horror movies. And as for that creature, it certainly belongs in the pages of pulp fiction, not in our reality. Never in my wildest imaginings did I ever expect us to witness something so outlandish in our reality." "But it was real," piped Rebecca. "Even though it was terrifying in its appearance, I knew it had come to our rescue. I sensed it." We all agreed to that. "What did you suppose happened to the so-called caretaker?" I asked. "I'm not sure," said Rebecca, "but if that creature left him dead, I don't care, because a man like that should not be left wandering around. He's certifiable and exceedingly dangerous. Well, I've been in touch with the Alberta police, and no one has reported any sightings of the thug." I have to concede, said Sally, raising her glass. I somehow think Merrill, she said, looking at me with bright, sparkling eyes, has eclipsed the all of us. Because when it comes to our hen parties in the future, they will definitely not be as memorable as yours was. No one will ever forget the week that we spent at the cabin with you. How shall I describe it? Fun, exciting, adventurous, memorable, beautiful, and completely, utterly, and totally terrifying. Now that is impossible to beat. Of course, she was exactly right about that, because whenever we did meet up on future dates, and even today, it's always my hen party that we talk about, whilst all the other hen parties are almost certainly long since forgotten. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.